The stone floor bit through the soles of Elias Thorne's shoes, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the April air outside and everything to do with the sheer, sucking weight of Westminster Hall. He set the silver inkwell down. Precision mattered. His fingers, trembling despite his best efforts to lock the joints, arranged the quills in a strict line of descending stiffness, the goose feathers pale and brittle against the scarred oak of the clerk's table. One blot would ruin the day. One stray drop of iron gall could stain the record of a peer's life, turning legal fact into messy suggestion, and Thorne could not abide a mess. He tested the nib of the primary quill against a scrap of parchment, listening for the scratch that meant readiness, a sound like dry leaves skittering over flagstones. Above him, the high windows pierced the gloom with shafts of pale, dusty light, where motes danced in a chaotic swirl, gathering thick around the empty chair reserved for the accused, as if the very air recognized a vacancy waiting to be filled by something other than flesh. Footsteps echoed, not the shuffling of servants, but the heavy, deliberate tread of men who believed the ground owed them reverence. Thorne dropped his gaze, fixing his attention on the roll of indictment scrolls bound in red tape, which smelled sharply of vinegar and the sour tang of old anxiety stored too long in a cellar. The Lord High Steward entered, leading the procession of peers, their ermine robes whisking against the stone with a dry, whispering friction that seemed to hush the room more effectively than any command. They took their places upon the woolpacks, settling with the gravity of judges who have already decided the outcome before the first word is spoken. Thorne dipped his quill into the silver well. The ink rose dark and viscous, clinging to the nib like oil drawn from a dark lamp, thicker and more permanent than the water he drank to steady his nerves. It was a cold fluid, unyielding in the pot, promising that whatever it touched would remain fixed against the erosion of memory or mercy. "Make ready, Mr. Thorne," the Clerk of the Crown muttered, not looking up from his own papers. "Ready, sir," Thorne replied, the words catching in a throat suddenly too tight for speech. The great doors groaned open again, admitting a draught that sent the dust motes into a frenzy, swirling violently before settling once more around the figure now standing at the bar. Laurence Shirley, the Earl Ferrers. He wore mourning black, a suit of such deep dye that it seemed to absorb the weak light of the hall rather to reflect it, leaving his face floating in a void of fabric. Ferrers did not glance at the gallery, nor did he seek the eyes of his accusers. Instead, he fixed his stare upon the Lord High Steward with a rigidity that suggested a man holding his own bones together by sheer force of will. Thorne watched the Earl's hands. They rested at his sides, perfectly still, betraying nothing of the shackles hidden beneath the wide cuffs of his coat, while the rest of the room shifted in anticipatory discomfort, the rustle of silk and the clearing of throats marking the passage of seconds that felt like hours. Laurence Shirley, Earl Ferrers, the Clerk of the Crown, began, his voice rolling through the vast space with a rhythmic cadence that turned the accusation of murder into a liturgical chant, devoid of passion but heavy with consequence. "You stand indicted for the willful murder of John Johnson." Thorne's hand moved automatically, the quill scratching across the page as he transcribed the title and the charge, the letters forming themselves with a neatness that belied the recall of his mind. Willful murder. The ink stained the fresh page, black and final, each loop and crossbar a small brick in a wall being built word by word. Outside, beyond the thick walls of the hall, the tower clock struck the hour, its ticking penetrating the silence not as a measurement of time, but as a structural rhythm, a relentless hammering that marked the irreversible erosion of the Earl's remaining days. Every beat of the clock stripped another layer of presumption from the man at the bar, reducing him from a peer of the realm to a defendant, and soon, if the machinery held true, to a corpse. Ferrers shifted his weight, just an inch, enough to make the floorboard creak under his boot, a sharp, human sound amidst the sterile recitation of legal formulae. "God and my country," Ferrers said, his voice cutting through the dust-choked air with a clarity that startled Thorne into lifting his quill from the paper. "I am ready to be tried by my peers." The words hung there, suspended in the light among the swirling dust, bold and defiant, suggesting a man who believed himself still master of his own destiny despite the ropes tightening around his life. Thorne paused, the nib hovering a fraction above the parchment, a single drop of black ink swelling at the tip, threatening to fall and spoil the line before it was even written. He waited for the instruction to proceed, knowing that once he set that drop down, once he accorded the plea and the subsequent testimony, the ink would dry into a truth that could not be scraped away, no matter how loud-lithe conscience might scream against it. As the clock ticked and the dust settled, the Earl stood waiting. The drop trembled, a black eye opening at the nib's tip, threatening to fall and ruin the white space before the plea was even set down in permanent script. Thorne held his breath, lungs burning with the stale air of the hall, waiting for the Lord High Steward to acknowledge the Earl's defiance with the nod that would unleash the floodgates of testimony. "Proceed," the steward said, his voice dry as parchment, devoid of the tremor that shook the lesser men in the gallery. The quill descended. It kissed the page with a wet scratch, anchoring the Earl's words to the paper where they would sit, immutable, long after the voice that spoke them had been stilled by the hangman's rope. Thorne wrote God and my country in his tightest hand, the loops of the G and C curling like smoke from an extinguished candle, beautiful and useless against the charge of blood. He felt the vibration of Ferrers' voice still humming in the floorboards, a physical resonance that traveled up through the legs of the table and into his own wrists, making the pen shake despite his best efforts to steady it. This was the machine, not the gallows awaiting the prisoner in May, nor the axe that usually served the nobility, but this quiet room where men in ermine turned a life into a sequence of nouns and verbs. Thorne watched the ink sink into the fiber of the paper, drinking deep until the surface gleamed with a dark, oily sheen. It looked too much like the wound he had seen described in the coroner's report, a puncture of silver steel into the soft flesh of the steward Johnson. Only here the bleeding was slow, administrative, and sanctioned by the highest laws of the land. "The prosecution will call its first witness," the clerk of the Crown announced, shuffling a stack of papers that rasped against the oak like dry skin. Thorne dipped the quill again. The silver well offered no resistance, cold and smooth under his thumb, a stark contrast to the sweat slicking his palm. He wrote the name of the first witness, a surgeon from Staffordshire, and the date, 16 April 1760, each numeral a nail driven into the coffin of the Earl's freedom. The clock outside ticked on, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the stone walls, its rhythm marking the seconds as they slipped away, never to be reclaimed. Tick, tock. Tick, the sound was not a measurement, but a countdown, a relentless drumming that synced with the beating of Thorne's own heart, urging him to write faster, to capture every syllable before the moment vanished into the past. Ferrers remained still. He did not flinch when the surgeon's name was called, nor did he turn to look at the man who would soon describe the angle of the pistol shot that ended John Johnson's life. Instead, the Earl focused on a point somewhere above the steward's head, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to read an inscription on the high roof beams that only he could see. There was a madness in that stillness, a coiled tension that suggested the calm was merely a veneer over a churning sea of delusion. Thorne had read the depositions. He knew the Earl believed Johnson had conspired against him, that the steward was a traitor deserving of death, a narrative so vivid in Ferrers' mind that it had overwritten the reality of the law. Yet here in this hall, that narrative held no currency. Only the transcript mattered. Only the words Thorne set down would survive to justify the state's taking of a peer's life. "Dr. James Monroe," the clerk intoned, "step forward." A man in a somber coat detached himself from the shadows near the pillar, his boots clicking sharply on the flagstones as he approached the bar. He carried the smell of the street with him, a mix of coal smoke and damp wool that clashed with the vinegar scent of the scrolls. Thorne watched the doctor's hands as they rested on the railing, clean and steady, the hands of a man who dealt in facts rather than feuds. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the steward asked. "I do," Monroe replied, his voice clear and devoid of the trembling reverence that afflicted the other witnesses. Thorne's quill flew across the page, capturing the oath, the affirmation, the slight cough that preceded the first question. He wrote without thinking, his hand moving in a rhythm dictated by the cadence of the interrogation, the ink flowing in a continuous stream that mirrored the relentless march of the proceedings. but beneath the automatic motion of his wrist, his mind recoiled. He was not merely recording, he was building the case. Every word he transcribed added another brick to the wall closing around Ferrers, sealing him in a tomb of legal precedent from which there was no escape. "And what did you observe upon examining the body of John Johnson?" the prosecutor asked, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with the predatory focus of a man who smells victory. Monro cleared his throat. "I observed a single entrance wound, situated below the left rib, consistent with a discharge from a pistol at close range." Thorne wrote close range. The words looked innocent enough on the page, neat and orderly, but they carried the weight of execution order. He could almost see the scene the doctor described. The study at Staunton Harold, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air, the steward crumpled on the floor while his master stood over him, convinced of his own righteousness. The ink seemed to thicken as he wrote, resisting the flow, as if the quill itself objected to committing the horror to permanence. "Did the deceased offer any resistance?" "None that I could ascertain from the wound trajectory," Monro stated, his gaze flickering briefly towards Ferrers before returning to the steward. "The shot was fired from behind, or whilst the victim was turned away." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a low hum of disapproval that vibrated against Thorne's ribs. Ferrers did not react. He stood as rigid as a statue carved from jet, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain that fooled no one who had read the letters describing his rages. Thorne watched the Earl's fingers twitch, just once, a spasmodic jerk that betrayed the control he projected. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but to Thorne it screamed of the violence simmering beneath the surface, the same violence that had driven a bullet into Johnson's back. The clock struck the half-hour. The sound boomed through the hall, a deep, resonant toll that seemed to shake the dust motes from their lazy dance. For a second, the light shifted, a cloud passing over the sun outside, plunging the bar into shadow. Ferrers blinked, his eyes losing their focus for a heartbeat before snapping back to the steward, sharp and dangerous. "Continue," the steward commanded, unmoved by the theatrical gloom. Thorne dipped his quill. The inkwell was half empty now, the silver bottom beginning to show through the dark fluid, a gleaming reminder of the cold metal that anchored the law. He wrote down the next question, then the answer, the words piling up on the page like stones in a cairn marking a grave. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to stop, to lay down the pen and refuse to participate in this sanitized slaughter. But he did not stop. He could not. The machinery of the court demanded its fuel, and his ink was the blood that kept the gears turning. "And in your professional opinion," the prosecutor pressed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried perfectly in the silent hall, "was the wound fatal in itself?" "Immediately fatal," Monro confirmed. "Death would have been instantaneous." Thorne wrote instantaneous. The long word stretched across the line, a finality that left no room for hope, no space for mercy. He lifted the quill, the nib dripping a single fat drop of ink onto the blotter where it spread like a bruise. He looked up at Ferrers. The Earl was watching him now, those dark eyes locking onto Thorne's with an intensity that made the clerk's stomach turn. It was not a look of hatred, but of recognition, as if Ferrers knew exactly what Thorne was doing, knew that every scratch of the quill was a nail in his coffin. The dust motes swirled thicker around the Earl, dancing in the shaft of light that had found him again, illuminating the sweat on his brow and the tight set of his jaw. He looked less like a peer of the realm and more like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the push. Thorne felt the weight of the silver inkwell under his hand, cold and unyielding, anchoring him to the table, to the task, to the terrible necessity of recording the end of a life. "The defense may cross-examine," the steward said, leaning back, his expression unreadable. Ferrers stirred. He took a step forward, the chains beneath his coat rattling softly, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out immediately, only a harsh intake of breath that sounded like a sob stifled in the throat. Then his voice cracked, loud and jagged, shattering the liturgical calm of the courtroom. "He deserved it," Ferrers said, the words tumbling out in a rush, desperate and raw. "Johnson was a traitor. I have the letters. I can show you the letters." The gallery gasped. The steward's gavel slammed down, a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot. Thorne's hand froze, the quill hovering over the page, the ink pooling at the tip once more, ready to stain the record with the Earl's unraveling mind. He looked at the frantic eyes of the accused, then down at the pristine line of text waiting to be completed, and realized with a sinking horror that the truth no longer mattered. Only the transcript would remain. The echo of the wood against the table lingered, vibrating through the oak and into Thorne's wrist, a physical rebuke that traveled up the bone. He lowered the quill, setting the nib upon the blotter to catch the swell of ink that threatened to drown the word instantaneous. It spread there, a dark pupil dilating in the white field, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Around the bar, the peers shifted, the rustle of silk and ermine sounding like dry leaves skittering over grave. None of them looked at Ferrers. They studied their hands, the pillars, the distant vaulted roof, anywhere but at the man who had just confessed to murder in the eyes of God. The Lord High Steward did not raise his voice again. He merely waited, his gaze fixed upon the Earl with the patience of a stone statue observing a mayfly. "You are here to be tried by your peers, my lord," the steward said, the words dropping heavily into the quiet. "Not to deliver sermons on justice. If you have evidence, it will be entered in its proper turn. Until then, you will answer to the charge." Ferrers drew a breath that hitched in his throat, a ragged sound that exposed the fragility beneath the morning black. He straightened his coat, pulling the fabric down over his hips with a jerky, mechanical motion, as if attempting to smooth out the wrinkles in his own sanity. The chains beneath the cloth clinked, a sharp metallic counterpoint to the soft shuffle of the gallery. "I have the letters," Ferrers repeated, though the volume had dropped as the desperation leached out under the steward's cold authority. "Johnson corresponded with my enemies. He sought to ruin me. It was not murder, it was execution." A murmur touched the benches, quickly stifled by a glare from the ushers. Thorne watched the Earl's hands again. They were no longer still. They fluttered at his sides, fingers opening and closing like fish gasping on a dock, seeking purchase on an air that offered none. The dust motes had settled somewhat, no longer dancing in a frenzy, but hanging suspended in the shafts of light, marking the stillness that had returned to the hall. It was a heavy quiet, thick with the smell of wool and the sour tang of fear sweating through fine linen. Thorne dipped the quill once more. The ink felt colder this time, chilled by the air of the room, and it flowed onto the parchment with a reluctance that matched his own spirit. He wrote the steward's words, then the Earl's reply, the script tightening as his hand cramped. Every letter formed was a brick in the wall closing Ferrers in. He could feel the weight of the silver inkwell beneath his left palm, the metal leaching the warmth from his skin, grounding him to the table while his mind wished to flee. This was the bargain, accuracy in exchange for innocence. If he recorded the madness perfectly, surely he bore no share of it. The clock outside struck the 3/4. The sound was distant, muffled by the thick stone walls, yet it penetrated the room with the inevitability of a heartbeat. One toll, 2, 3. Each beat measured out a portion of the Earl's remaining life, ticking away the seconds until the rope would do the work of time. Ferrers flinched at the sound, his head turning slightly towards the high windows as if he could see the mechanism through the stone. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, revealing a childlike confusion behind the eyes, a bewilderment that a man of his station should be subjected to the counting of minutes like a common debtor. "Proceed to the arraignment," the steward instructed, turning his attention to the clerk of the crown. The clerk stood, unfolding a sheet of parchment that crackled like dry skin in the silence. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and official, stripping the atmosphere of the remaining humanity. Thorne positioned his quill at the top of a fresh page, the nib hovering just above the surface, ready to catch the formal words that would bind the accused to the process. The dust motes stirred again, lifted by the movement of the clerk's robes, swirling around Ferrers' head like a crown of grey smoke. "Laurence Shirley, Earl Ferrers," the clerk intoned, his voice devoid of inflection, an instrument of the law rather than a man. "You stand indicted for the willful murder of John Johnson. How say you? Are you guilty or not guilty?" The question hung in the air, suspended between the stone floor and the vaulted ceiling. It was a simple binary, a fork in the road that allowed for no middle ground, no mitigation, no letters hidden in a desk drawer at Staunton Harold. Ferrers opened his mouth. He closed it. His tongue touched his lips, moistening them, a small human gesture in the face of the machinery grinding towards him. He looked at the steward, then at the peers, and finally his gaze swept across the table until it landed on Thorne. Thorne held the quill steady. He did not blink. He offered no encouragement, no judgment, only the white space of the page waiting to be filled. The ink at the tip of the nib began to dry, forming a tiny crust that would need to be cleared before the first letter could be laid down. It was a trivial obstruction, yet it felt significant, a final delay before the path was set. The clock ticked again, louder this time, or perhaps the silence had grown deep enough to carry the sound further. Ferrers lifted his chin. The confusion vanished, replaced by a brittle defiance that seemed to cost him physical effort to maintain. He drew himself up to his full height, the chains shifting beneath the black cloth, and looked the clerk in the eye. "Not guilty," Ferrers said. The word landed on the page before Thorne had even moved his hand, etched into the air of the hall. He pressed the nib down, the metal tines spreading to release the flow of dark fluid. "Not guilty." The letters formed smoothly, looping and sharp, a lie or a truth that no longer mattered. The ink soaked into the fiber, binding itself to the paper, permanent and unchangeable. Thorne lifted the quill, the nib catching a stray thread of parchment, and looked up. The Earl was still watching him, his expression unreadable, as if waiting to see if the clerk would bleed now that the first word was written. The clock ticked on, counting down the moments until the next lie would be required. The word dropped from Ferrers' lips like a stone into a dry well, heavy and final, echoing off the vaulted ribs of Westminster Hall before dissolving into the collective intake of breath from the peers. Thorne drove the nib into the parchment, the metal tines splaying to release a sudden gush of iron gall that bloomed across the fiber with a wet, sucking sound. He wrote the plea, his hand moving with a mechanical precision that belied the tremor running up his forearm, locking the Earl's denial into the permanent record before the echo had even faded. It was done. The ink sat wet and black, a fresh wound on the white page that refused to heal or fade, mirroring the violence it sought to contain. Ferrers straightened, the chains beneath his black velvet coat shifting with a dull clink that sounded too much like the turning of a key in a lock. He surveyed the assembled lords, his gaze sweeping over the ermine robes and powdered wigs with an aristocratic confidence that seemed borrowed from a man who still believed his title offered protection against the hangman's noose. "I am incapable of the malice they attribute to me," he declared, his voice resonating with a clarity that commanded the room, stripping the accusation of its common criminal stain. "A man of my station does not murder. He disciplines, he corrects, he maintains order within his own domain." The distinction hung in the air, fragile and desperate, a plea for the court to recognize a difference between the justice of a peer and the brutality of a felon. Thorne recorded every syllable, the scratch of his quill unnaturally loud in the sudden hush that followed, each loop and cross of the pen feeling like a nail driven into the coffin of the Earl's dignity. The Lord High Steward leaned forward, the heavy gold chain of office resting against his chest like a yoke, and nodded to the prosecution without a word. Counsel Davenport rose, unfolding a sheaf of papers with a crisp snap that cut through the lingering resonance of Ferrers' voice. He began to speak, his tone cold and administrative, reducing the life of John Johnson to a sequence of dates, times, and actionable offenses that stripped the event of all emotional context. On the 30th of January, the accused summoned the deceased to the study at Staunton Harold, Davenport intoned, pacing the space before the bar with the rhythmic certainty of a man walking a familiar gallows. There, in a fit of rage born of a disputed account, he discharged a pistol at close range. Thorne's hand faltered as he transcribed the phrase close range. The ink pooled at the base of the letter C, a dark swelling that threatened to drown the word before he could lift the nib. He saw it then, not as legal text, but as a visceral image. The study, the smell of burnt powder hanging thick in the stagnant air, the steward crumpling to the floor while his master stood over him, convinced of his own righteousness. The description felt too intimate, a violation of the dead man's privacy that turned his final moments into public entertainment for the nobility. Thorne pressed harder, forcing the quill to move, pushing the ink through the fiber until he feared it would soak through to the other side and stain the table beneath. He was not merely recording, he was reenacting the shooting with every stroke, driving the bullet of words deeper into the body of the text. "Objection," Ferrers interrupted, his voice rising in pitch as Davenport detailed the position of the body. "The account is incomplete. Johnson owed me 3 years' wages. He sought to defraud me." The Earl leaned over the bar, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity that made the nearby peers shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was not murder, it was the collection of a debt. The Lord High Steward raised a hand, a sharp, dismissing gesture that sliced through the Earl's protest. "My Lord Ferrers," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you will remain silent while the Crown presents its case. Your time to speak will come, but you will not dictate the terms of this inquiry." The muscle in Ferrers' jaw tightened, a visible cord standing out against the pale skin as he fought the urge to lash out. He clenched his fists, the knuckles whitening beneath the black velvet, and sank back onto the bench, his silence forced and volatile, like a storm held back by a crumbling dam. Thorne watched the struggle, a flicker of sympathy rising in his chest, despite his resolve to remain detached. He recognized the frustration, the maddening sensation of being misunderstood by a mechanism that cared only for procedure and not for truth. Ferrers was not merely a murderer in this moment. He was a man watching his own narrative being stolen from him, rewritten by men who had never known the burden of managing a restless estate or the sting of a servant's betrayal. Yet as Davenport continued, listing the wounds with clinical detachment, Thorne hardened his heart. Accuracy was his shield. If he recorded the madness perfectly, if he captured every outburst and every delusion without flinching, he bore no share of the guilt. He was the mirror, not the maker of the image. The morning session dragged on, the light in the hall shifting from the grey of dawn to the pale white of midday, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the beams like unsettled spirits. When the steward finally struck the gavel to adjourn for refreshment, the sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot, signaling a temporary reprieve. The peers rose, their robes rustling like dry leaves as they filed out towards the antechambers, leaving the hall empty save for the clerks and the accused. Ferrers remained seated, his head bowed, staring at the floor as if the stones might offer him some secret counsel. Thorne sat alone at his desk, the quiet of the room pressing against his ears after the cacophony of the trial. He reviewed the pages, his eyes tracing the lines of script he had just written. In the margin where Ferrers had shouted about the debt, the ink had soaked through the parchment, a dark stain that bled into the fiber of the next page. It looked like a bruise, a permanent mark of the Earl's volatility that no amount of scraping or washing could remove. The dust motes settled on the unused corner of the desk, coating the wood in a fine grey layer, waiting to be disturbed by the afternoon's proceedings. He touched the stain with his finger, feeling the slight roughness where the paper had swollen and dried, and realized with a sinking heart that the record was already tainted. A movement caught his eye. Ferrers had lifted his head. Across the expanse of the hall, through the gap between the benches of the lords, the Earl's gaze locked onto Thorne. It was not a look of anger, nor of pleading, but of desperate recognition, as if he saw in the clerk the only other soul who understood the terrible machinery they were both trapped within. For a heartbeat, the distance between them vanished, and Thorne felt the weight of the Earl's expectation, the silent demand that he be seen as a man and not just a defendant. Then Thorne looked down at his own hands, resting on the edge of the desk. They were stained with ink, black smudges ingrained in the cuticles and lining the creases of his palms, the mark of his trade. To Ferrers, he was not a neutral observer. He was the agent of the state, the scribe who was documenting his undoing, one perfect, damning word at a time. The ink would not wash off, and neither would this. Counsel Davenport rose from the bench, the silk of his gown whispering against the wood with a dry, rasping sound that drew every eye in the hall. He did not look at the Earl. His gaze remained fixed on the Lord High Steward, anchoring his words to the authority of the court rather than the man in the dock. "My lords," Davenport began, his voice flat and stripped of ornamentation, "we are not here to debate the intricacies of estate management. We are here to account for a life extinguished." Thorne dipped his quill. The nib hovered over the parchment, waiting for the next substantive clause. He needed only the facts, the sequence of actions that transformed a dispute into a crime. Davenport proceeded to outline the timeline with cold, administrative efficiency, reducing the chaotic final moments of John Johnson to a series of actionable offenses. There was no passion in the recitation, no mourning for the steward, only the sterile architecture of the law being erected around the corpse. On the afternoon of the 13th day of January, Davenport stated, pacing the space before the bar, the accused retrieved a pistol from his private chamber. He loaded it with powder and ball. He then sought out the deceased. The words landed on the page like stones. Thorne wrote them down, his hand moving automatically, but his mind resisted the simplicity of the syntax. It was never just a retrieval, it was a choice. He pressed the nib harder, forcing the ink to flow, fighting the urge to qualify the statement with the Earl's own justification. The quill scratched, a rhythmic counterpoint to Davenport's monotone, marking the passage of time in tiny, irreversible strokes. The deceased was engaged in his duties within the counting house, Davenport continued, turning slightly to address the peers. He was unarmed. He offered no resistance. Thorne's hand faltered. The description of the wound lay next in the brief, a clinical detail that felt too intimate for public record. He hesitated, the nib resting on the fiber of the paper. For a second, the ink pooled at the tip, a dark swelling that threatened to drown the word before he could lift the pen. He saw it then, not as legal text, but as a visceral image. The study, the smell of burnt powder hanging thick in the stagnant air, the steward crumpling to the floor while his master stood over him. The description felt like a violation of the dead man's privacy, turning his final moments into public entertainment for the nobility. Thorne pressed harder, forcing the quill to move. He pushed the ink through the fiber until he feared it would soak through to the other side and stain the table beneath. He was not merely recording, he was reenacting the shooting with every stroke, driving the bullet of words deeper into the body of the text. The ink spread, a small black star blooming on the page, marking the spot where the life had ended. "Enter the left shoulder," Davenport said, ticking the points off on his fingers as he continued. "Traverse the chest, then exit near the spine." The specificity was brutal. Thorne transcribed the trajectory, his letters tightening as the tension in his shoulders grew. He could feel the weight of the Earl's presence behind him, a physical pressure between the shoulder blades. Ferrers sat still, but the air around him seemed to vibrate with suppressed energy, like a storm held back by a crumbling dam. Thorne knew the Earl was listening to every word, dissecting the description for errors, for inaccuracies that might serve as a foothold for his defense. Davenport paused to consult his notes, the silence stretching thin across the hall. In that quiet, the shuffle of robes and the cough of a distant peer sounded unnaturally loud. Thorne used the break to blot the excess ink from the page, pressing the sand shaker down with more force than necessary. The grit scratched against the parchment, a rough texture that grounded him in the physical reality of the task. He was a clerk. His duty was accuracy. If he recorded the madness perfectly, if he captured every outburst and every delusion without flinching, he bore no share of the guilt. He was the mirror, not the maker of the image. The motive, Davenport resumed, his voice dropping an octave, was established grievance. The accused believed the deceased had acted against his interests. Ferrers shifted on the bench. The leather of his seat creaked, a sharp sound that cut through the lower murmurs of the lords. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the bar until the knuckles turned white beneath the skin. Thorne saw the movement in his peripheral vision, a tightening of the frame that suggested an imminent eruption. The Earl's breathing had changed, becoming shallower, quicker, as the prosecution's narrative stripped away the layers of his justification. "Objection," Ferrers muttered, though the word was barely audible. Davenport ignored him, pressing on with the timeline. He spoke of the letters, of the accounts, of the perceived slights that had festered at Staunton Harold until they demanded blood. Each detail was a brick in the wall closing around the accused. Thorne wrote it all down, the scratch of his nib sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that followed the Earl's declaration. He did not look up. To meet the Earl's eye now would be to acknowledge the humanity behind the crime, and he could not afford that luxury. A witness was called to testify regarding the relationship between the Earl and the steward. The man was small, nervous, his hands trembling as he approached the bar. He spoke of a history of grievances that painted Ferrers as vindictive rather than merely disciplinarian. He spoke of locked doors, of withheld wages, of threats made in the shadow of the kitchen stairs. Thorne recorded the testimony, his hand moving faster now to keep pace with the witness's anxious rush of words. The Earl interrupted the testimony to correct a detail regarding a debt. His voice rose in pitch, sharp and brittle, as he attempted to assert control over the narrative. Thorne observed the Lord High Steward warning the accused to remain silent, a gesture that visibly tightened the muscle in Ferrers' jaw. The tension in the room spiked, the air growing heavy with the expectation of conflict. Thorne dipped his quill again, the inkwell reflecting the pale light from the high windows. He was ready. The record would hold. 5 guineas, the witness stammered, his eyes fixed on the pattern of the rushes beneath his boots rather than the noble face he accused. He said the account was short by 5 guineas, my lords, and he would not release the wages until the sum was found. Ferrers surged upward. The movement was not the dignified rise of a peer answering a query, but the lurch of a trapped animal testing the bars of its cage. His chair scraped against the stone floor, a shriek of wood on rock that set several lords shifting in their ermine robes. That is a lie, Ferrers shouted, the sound cracking against the vaulted ceiling. The sum was £4, 12 shillings. Johnson knew the ledger, he knew the entry. Sit down, my lord, the Lord High Steward intoned, his voice devoid of inflection yet carrying the weight of a closing door. He did not raise his voice, he merely lifted a hand, palm outward, a gesture of dismissal so absolute it seemed to push the air from the room. You are to remain silent while the witness gives his evidence. Any further interruption will be noted as contempt. The muscle in Ferrers' jaw jumped, a visible spasm beneath the pale skin that spoke of teeth grinding together until they threatened to fracture. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, his chest heaving beneath the heavy silk of his waistcoat, before collapsing back onto the bench with a thud that shook the frame. The defeat was physical, a deflation of the lungs that left him staring straight ahead, unblinking. Thorne's quill hovered above the page, the nib trembling slightly as it waited for the ink to settle. He watched the Earl's hands, which now lay flat on the table, fingers splayed wide as if trying to anchor himself to the wood. The rage had not vanished. It had merely been driven inward, compressing into a dense, hot core that radiated from the man's stillness. To record this required a cruelty of precision, a refusal to soften the edges of the humiliation with adverbs or explanatory clauses. Thorne pressed the nib down. He wrote the steward's warning. He wrote the silence that followed. The scratch of the pen sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet hall. The witness may continue, the steward said, lowering his hand. The small man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat tight with fear. He resumed his testimony, speaking now in a rush, eager to finish, before the volatile nobleman found another breach in the protocol. He spoke of the locked study, of the keys kept on a ring that never left Ferrers' person, of the nights when Johnson had been forced to sleep on the floor of the counting house because the master deemed him untrustworthy. Each detail was a nail driven into the coffin of Ferrers' defense, constructing a portrait of a master whose paranoia had curdled into violence. Thorne wrote it all. The words flowed from his hand in a steady black stream, indifferent to the tragedy they described. He felt a strange dissociation, as though his arm belonged to someone else, a machine built solely to transfer sound to symbol. The inkwell sat to his right, a pool of dark potential that seemed deeper than its few inches of depth should allow. Every time he dipped the quill, the silver rim clicked against the metal, a small, sharp note that marked the passage of another second of the Earl's life. And did the accused ever threaten the deceased? Davenport asked, leaning against the bar with an air of casual inquiry that masked the trap being sprung. He said, the witness whispered, glancing nervously at Ferrers, he said that if the books did not balance, blood would. Ferrers let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a dry, brittle sound, devoid of humor, like a twig snapping underfoot. He turned his head slowly towards the witness, his eyes narrow and bright with a feverish intensity. I spoke of accountancy, Ferrers said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the stillness. I spoke of balances. You twist the tongue of a gentleman to make it speak of butchery. "The court is not interested in your semantics, my lord," the steward replied, his gaze fixed on the witness. "Proceed." Thorne felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, itching as it navigated the path towards his collar. He did not wipe it away. To move would be to break the spell of the transcription, to acknowledge the heat and the smell of unwashed bodies and old wool that hung heavy in the hall. He kept his eyes on the parchment, watching the lines of text grow longer, denser, until the page looked less like a record of proceedings and more like a confession extracted under duress. The handwriting remained impeccable, a model of clerical neutrality, even as the content described a mind unraveling in public. The morning light shifted, sliding across the floorboards to illuminate the dust that danced in the air between the bench and the bar. Those motes swirled around Ferrers, catching the light like tiny suspended stars before settling on the shoulders of his coat as he sat motionless. He looked smaller now, stripped of the bluster that had opened the session, reduced to a man arguing over shillings while the noose tightened invisibly around his neck. Thorne saw the way the Earl's fingers tapped a silent, erratic rhythm on the wood, a code of frustration that no one else seemed to notice. Davenport concluded his line of questioning, stepping back to allow the defense counsel room to maneuver, though there was little ground to be gained. The Lord High Steward consulted the great clock on the wall, its face golden and solemn in the dim light. The hands pointed to the hour of adjournment. "The court will rise," the steward announced, the gavel falling with a single, definitive crack. "We shall reconvene at 2 o'clock." The sound of the gavel broke the tension, releasing the held breath of the gallery in a collective exhale. Peers began to stand, the rustle of silk and the creak of leather filling the space as they stretched stiff limbs. Servants moved forward with trays of wine and water, offering refreshment to the judges while the accused remained seated, isolated behind the bar. Thorne set his quill down in the sand tray, the feather trembling slightly as it came to rest. He looked at the page before him, the fresh ink still glistening wetly in the shafts of light. In his haste during the outburst, he had pressed too hard. The letters describing the debt were dark and swollen, the ink having soaked through the thin parchment to stain the sheet beneath. A ghost of the word guineas bled onto the next page, a shadow of a crime yet to be fully recorded. He ran a thumb over the spot, feeling the rough texture where the fiber had absorbed too much liquid. It was a flaw in the record, a physical manifestation of the pressure that had built in the room. He glanced up, intending to check the time against the tower clock, but his gaze snagged on the figure behind the bar. Ferrers was not drinking, he was not speaking to his counsel, he was looking directly at Thorne. The Earl's eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until the iris was barely visible, giving him a look of terrifying clarity. There was no anger in that stare now, no aristocratic disdain. There was only a raw, desperate recognition, an acknowledgement that the man with the quill was not merely observing the destruction, but actively building it, letter by letter. Ferrers' lips parted slightly, as if he meant to speak, to call out to the scribe who held his fate in a bottle of iron gall. Thorne froze, the air catching in his throat. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the edge of the desk. They were stained with black, the ink ingrained in the creases of his knuckles, and under the nails, permanent marks that no amount of washing would remove before the next session. To the Earl, those hands were not the tools of a neutral clerk. They were the instruments of the state, just as surely as the rope that waited at Tyburn. Thorne curled his fingers into a fist, hiding the stains from view, but the feeling of the ink remained, cold and heavy on his skin. The bell tolled twice, a bronze throat clearing in the tower above, signaling the end of the respite. Peers shuffled back into their rows, the ermine on their shoulders catching the dull afternoon light that filtered through the high windows. Thorne sat already, his quill positioned over the fresh sheet, though he did not dip it. The stain on his knuckles had dried to a matte black, a permanent brand he could not scrub away before the session resumed. He kept his hands beneath the table, clasped tight in his lap, hiding the evidence of his labor from the accused. Ferrers occupied the same spot behind the bar, yet the air around him had shifted. The bluster of the morning had evaporated, leaving a brittle stillness that seemed to draw the noise of the hall towards him. He did not look at Thorne now. His gaze was fixed on the prosecution table, where the counsel for the crown was reaching into a leather satchel. The sound of the buckle undoing clicked sharply, cutting through the murmur of conversation like a knife. A pistol emerged. It was not an ornate dueling piece, nor a soldier's field weapon, but a sturdy horseman's firearm, dark with oil and use. The prosecution counsel held it by the barrel, presenting the wooden grip to the Lord High Steward as one might offer a poisonous snake. Steel gleamed dully against the warm tones of the wood, cold and unyielding in the warmth of the crowded hall. Thorne leaned forward involuntarily, the scent of gun oil drifting across the distance to mix with the smell of old parchment and unwashed wool. It was a mechanical smell, industrial and sharp, clashing with the organic decay of the room. "Exhibit 1, the counsel said, his voice flat, the instrument used upon the person of the deceased. He placed it on the table, not on the prosecution's side, but on the clerk's station, directly beside Thorne's inkwell. The proximity was intentional, a physical weight added to the textual record. The metal base of the pistol rested on the wood with a solid thud that vibrated through the desk and into Thorne's forearms. He could see the scratches on the lock plate Thessaring 3 registered, where on the trigger guard, where a finger had rested often. It was not an object of theory. It was a thing that had broken flesh. Thorne dipped his quill. The silver inkwell sat inches from the gun, the smooth, cold metal of the pot contrasting with the rougher steel of the weapon. He wrote "pistol produced," the letters forming automatically while his peripheral vision remained locked on the barrel. Every scratch on the iron seemed to demand a footnote, every smudge of residue a confession. He pressed the nib harder than necessary, the paper resisting before accepting the flow of dark liquid. The ink spread, wet and glossy, looking too much like fresh blood against the cream fiber. He paused to sand the line, blowing the excess powder away. The grains scattered, settling on the desk, on the pistol on the back of his stained hand. For a moment, the black ink on his skin and the black steel of the gun looked identical, part of the same continuum of violence. He was recording the death, but the weapon was the cause, and he was merely the conduit. Without his words, the gun was just metal. Without the gun, his words were just fiction. Together, they made a truth that would hang a man. Ferrers shifted in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight, a loud protest in the quiet room. He looked at the pistol, then at Thorne's hand resting near it. There was no recognition this time, only a dull horror, as if he was seeing the instrument for the first time since the act itself. The Earl's mouth moved, forming a silent word that Thorne could not read, perhaps a denial or a prayer. It did not matter. The object sat between them, undeniable. "Describe the condition of the piece," the steward commanded. The counsel detailed the load, the priming, the state of the flint. Thorne transcribed every syllable, the scratching of his quill the only accompaniment to the voice. He wrote of powder charges and ignition, clinical terms that sanitized the explosion. Prime pan filled, flint secure. The language was clean, devoid of the noise or the smoke or the scream that had followed the pull of the trigger. He was distilling a murder into syntax, boiling down the chaos of Staunton Harold into neat lines of copperplate. A fly buzzed against the window pane, a frantic sound against the glass. Thorne ignored it. He focused on the way the light hit the barrel, creating a narrow line of white reflection that ran the length of the steel. It looked like a scratch, a flaw in the manufacture, or perhaps a mark from the struggle. He wanted to write it down to note the imperfection, but it was not part of the testimony. The record required only what was spoken, not what was seen. Truth was subordinate to procedure. He left the scratch unrecorded, a lie of omission etched into the permanent archive. The counsel finished his description and stepped back, leaving the pistol on the table. It sat there, heavy and silent, dominating the space between the clerk and the accused. Thorne could feel the heat radiating from it, or perhaps that was merely his own imagination projecting warmth onto the cold iron. He moved his hand slightly to reach for the sand shaker, his stained knuckles brushing against the wood near the trigger guard. He flinched, pulling back as if the metal burned. Ferrers saw the movement. A flicker of something passed over his face, too quick to name. Disgust, pity. He looked away, turning his head towards the gallery where the spectators sat packed tight in the upper rows. They leaned forward, hungry for the sight of the weapon that had felled a steward and toppled a peer. To them, it was a curiosity. To Thorne, it was an anchor dragging him down into the deep water of complicity. He capped the inkwell. The silver lid clicked shut, sealing the dark fluid inside. The session was not over, but the weight of the evidence had settled upon the room like a physical burden. The air grew thicker, harder to draw into the lungs. Thorne flexed his fingers, the dried ink cracking slightly on his skin. He needed to wash them. He needed to scrub until the raw flesh showed, but there was no water here, only more ink, more paper, more words. The steward nodded to the prosecution. "Call the next witness." The usher moved to the door, his staff tapping against the floor. A man emerged from the crowd, walking with a stiff gait, his face pale and drawn. He did not look at the pistol. He kept his eyes on the floor, stepping around the shadow cast by the weapon as if it were a hole in the ground. Thorne dipped his quill again, the nib hovering over the paper. He knew what was coming. The testimony would turn from the object to the body, from the steel to the flesh it had ruined. The witness took the stand. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in a thin neck. Thorne waited for the first word, the pen poised to catch the description of the wound. The ink pooled at the tip of the nib, a single dark sphere ready to fall. "Speak to the state of the deceased when you found him," the prosecutor said, his voice flat, stripping the horror of any adornment it might have claimed for itself. The witness, a groom from the Ferrers estate, whose hands still smelled of horse and stable straw, gripped the rail until his knuckles whitened. He did not look at Earl Ferrers. He looked at the space just above the Earl's left shoulder, where the ermine trim of a peer's robe blurred into the shadowed gallery. "He was on the floor of the parlour," the groom began, his voice cracking on the third word, a dry splinter in the quiet hall. Mr. Johnson lay upon his side, one leg drawn up as if he sought to rise, but lacked the strength to complete the motion. Thorne's quill scratched, a rhythmic insect noise that seemed to accelerate the passage of time even as the words slowed the room to a crawl. He wrote "lay" upon his side, the letters looping with a precision that felt obscene against the image forming in his mind. The ink flowed too easily, a dark river flooding the paper, eager to capture the suffering of a man who could no longer speak for himself. "There was blood," the groom continued, and the word dropped into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Much blood. It had soaked through his waistcoat and pooled beneath him on the boards. Thorne paused. The nib hovered, a single drop of ink swelling at its tip, trembling with the potential energy of the next phrase. He could smell the witness now, a mixture of fierce sweat and the metallic tang of old stable muck, a scent that seemed to cut through the lavender water and dust of the courtroom. It was the smell of the scene of the murder, transporting 40 miles to Westminster, invading the sterile air of the law. "Did he speak?" the prosecutor asked. "He tried," the groom swallowed, his throat working visibly. He made a sound, a wet rattling in his chest, but no words came. His eyes were open, fixed on the door, though I do not think he saw anything there. Thorne wrote "made a sound," a wet rattling. He did not write about the eyes. He did not write about the way the life had leaked out onto the floorboards, turning the wood dark and slick. The record required facts, not the visceral reality of a man drowning in his own vitality. He pressed the nib down, forcing the ink to flow, feeling the resistance of the paper as it absorbed the tragedy. The Earl shifted again. This time, the movement was not a creak of wood, but a sharp intake of breath, a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a cracked vessel. Ferrers leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the tendons stood out like cords beneath the skin of his wrists. "That is not true," Ferrers said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "Johnson spoke. He called me a villain. He threatened to ruin me." The Lord High Steward raised a hand, a gesture of mild reproval that carried the weight of absolute authority. "My Lord Ferrers, you will have your opportunity to cross-examine. Until then, you must remain silent." "He lied," Ferrers insisted, the words tumbling out faster now, losing their aristocratic polish, becoming rough and jagged. "The steward was insolent. He plotted against me. He deserved it." "Silence," the steward commanded, the gavel lifting slightly from the desk, a threat made of oak and precedent. Ferrers slammed his hand down on the rail. The crack was sharp, a pistol shot without the smoke, echoing off the vaulted ceiling and startling the peers in the front rows. One duke flinched, his ermine robes rustling as he pulled back from the outburst. The sound hung in the air, vibrating in the timber, a physical manifestation of the volatility the defense would later try to deny. Thorne's hand stopped. The quill rested on the paper, a black line trailing off into the margin where it did not belong. He looked at the Earl, seeing the flush rising in his cheeks, the tremor in the hand that had just struck the wood. This was the madness, raw and unfiltered, stripping away the veneer of noble composure to reveal the frightened, angry man beneath. He dipped the quill. The inkwell seemed deeper today, the silver rim cold against his thumb. He looked at the blank space where the record of the outburst should go. To write, the prisoner shouted, and struck the rail would be accurate. It would be true. But truth was a slippery commodity in Westminster Hall, often sacrificed on the altar of procedure. He moved the nib. The prisoner expressed dissatisfaction with the testimony. The lie sat on the page, neat and orderly, a sanitized version of the violence that had just occurred. It was a small edit, a mere adjustment of tone, yet it felt like a betrayal. He was smoothing the rough edges of the Earl's collapse, polishing the chaos until it fit the frame of the legal narrative. The ink dried quickly, sealing the distortion into permanence. "Proceed," the steward said, his eyes never leaving the witness, ignoring the Earl's heaving chest. The groom continued, his voice gaining strength now that the interruption had passed. He described carrying Johnson to the sofa, the weight of the dying man, the way the blood had stained his own sleeves, a mark he had not yet washed away. Thorne transcribed it all, the words piling up, a monument to the steward's suffering built from copperplate and iron gall. Every dip of the quill felt heavier. The silver inkwell, usually a reliable anchor, seemed to pull at his hand, dragging the words down into the paper with excessive force. He was filling the page with death, one looped letter at a time, creating a textual corpse that would outlast the flesh. The dust motes danced in the shaft of light falling across his desk, swirling around the pistol, around the ink, around his own stained fingers. "Did the deceased indicate who had shot him?" the prosecutor asked, the final question landing with the weight of a closing door. "He pointed," the groom said, lifting his own hand, trembling towards the bench where Ferrers sat. "He pointed at my lord, and then he ceased to breathe." The room held its breath. Even the fly had stopped its frantic buzzing against the glass. Ferrers stared at the groom, his mouth slightly open, no longer arguing, no longer shouting. He looked small, stripped of his title, reduced to a man accused by a dead finger. Thorne wrote "ceased to breathe." He finished the sentence, added the period, and lifted the quill. The nib was blunt now, worn down by the friction of the truth. He set it aside, the wood clicking against the desk. The prosecution had finished. The air in the hall felt thin, exhausted, as if the oxygen had been consumed by the recitation of the murder. "The Crown rests on this point," the prosecutor announced, stepping back to his seat, the rustle of his gown loud in the quiet. The Lord High Steward looked down at Ferrers. "My lord, the prosecution has concluded its primary evidence. You may call your witnesses, or you may speak to the court yourself." Ferrers did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands, then at the pistol, then at Thorne's transcript, where the sanitized record of his outburst sat next to the graphic description of Johnson's death. He seemed to realize, finally, that the paper held more power than the peerage, that the ink was the blood that would seal his fate. Ferrers started, then stopped. His voice failed him. Thorne reached for the sand shaker. He sprinkled the grey dust over the fresh lines, blotting the wet ink, hiding the gloss before it could reflect the light. He waited for the grain to absorb the fluid, turning the liquid words into something dry and permanent. When he brushed the excess away, the page looked clean, untouched by the tremor of his hand or the rage of the accused. He rolled the sheet carefully, the paper crackling softly, and tied it with a strip of red tape. The cylinder felt heavy in his hand, a compacted burden of life and death. He placed it in his satchel next to the silver inkwell, which he capped with a decisive click. The court was adjourning. The peers were rising, their robes sweeping the floor, the murmur of conversation beginning to fill the space where silence had reigned. Thorne stood, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, and gathered his things. He did not look at Ferrers. He could not bear to see the look in the Earl's eyes, the realization that the machine of the law was already grinding him down, powered by the very words Thorne had written. He moved towards the door, blending into the flow of clerks and ushers. Outside, the London afternoon waited, grey and indifferent. He would walk home through the mud and the noise, the image of the pistol and the pool of blood burned into his mind. Tonight, he would dream of ink turning to blood on his sheets, waking with the taste of iron in his mouth, long before the second day of the trial had even begun. The sand had barely settled before the Earl found his voice, though it emerged not as the polished instrument of a peer, but as a jagged thing scraped raw against the throat. "I must ask him," Ferrers said, rising so abruptly that his ermine robe slipped from one shoulder, exposing the dark wool beneath. "I must ask if Johnson did not first threaten me." The Lord High Steward leaned forward, the gold chain of his office catching the dull light. "My lord, you may not interrogate the witness on matters of character at this stage. Stick to the facts of the shooting." "But the insolence," Ferrers cried out, his hand shooting up, finger accusatory and shaking. "He called me a liar in my own hall, before my servants." "The court rules it irrelevant," the steward said, his voice flat, a stone dropped into a deep well. "Proceed to your defense or sit down." Ferrers slammed his palm against the wooden rail. The crack echoed through the hall, sharp and violent, startling a pigeon from the high rafters which fluttered down in a panic of grey feathers. Several peers shifted in their seats, the rustle of silk and the creak of wood marking their discomfort. One man, old and heavy-jowled, turned his head away as if the outburst were a foul smell he wished to avoid. Thorne dipped his quill, the nib hovering over the fresh line where the violence of the gesture demanded recording. To write the prisoner struck the rail in a fury would be the truth. It would capture the tremor in the Earl's hand, the flush rising up his neck, the way the veneer of aristocratic control had shattered like dropped porcelain. But the record was not a mirror. It was a filter, designed to strain out the mess of human emotion and leave only the clear, drinkable water of legal fact. He moved the hand. The ink flowed, dark and viscous. The prisoner expressed dissatisfaction with the ruling. The words sat there, neat and harmless, a sanitized ghost of the rage that had just filled the air. It was a lie, certainly, but it was a polite one, the kind of lie that allowed the machinery of the court to continue grinding without jamming on the rough edges of a madman's temper. Thorne felt a small, cold knot tighten in his stomach, a physical acknowledgement that he was no longer merely observing the trial, but actively shaping its reality, smoothing the spikes off the Earl's collapse so they would not prick the conscience of the jury. "Is that all?" the steward asked, his eyes already drifting towards the clock, impatient for the hour of adjournment. Ferrers stood trembling, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on the deck of a boat. He looked at the peers, searching for recognition, for some nod of understanding that his honor had been slighted, but found only a wall of impassive faces staring back. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until the Earl finally sank back onto his bench, defeated not by law, but by the sheer, indifferent weight of procedure. "The Crown rests," the prosecutor said again, louder this time, as if to bury the moment under the finality of his announcement. He gathered his papers, the sound crisp and decisive, signaling an end to the morning's bloodletting. Thorne blew gently on the page, watching the ink lose its sheen and turn matte. The scent of the iron gall rose up, sharp and metallic, mingling with the smell of old wool and the damp stone of the hall. It was the smell of permanence, of things fixed in place and unable to be undone. He reached for the sand shaker once more, dusting the fresh lines until they were dry to the touch, then brushed away the excess with a sweep of his sleeve. The grain fell to the desk, joining the other specks of grey that coated the wood like a fine layer of ash. He rolled the sheet tight, the paper resisting slightly before yielding to the cylinder shape, and secured it with a strip of red tape. The knot he tied was small and precise, a final seal on the day's work. He placed the roll into his satchel, feeling the weight of it settle against his hip, a tangible burden of life and death wrapped in brown paper. Around him, the hall was waking up. The peers were standing, stretching limbs stiff from hours of sitting, their conversations starting as low murmurs that quickly grew into a steady hum of gossip and speculation. The spell of the testimony had broken, dispersed by the mundane ritual of adjournment. Men adjusted their wigs, checked their watches, and began to drift towards the exits, eager for the fresh air of the yard and the promise of a warm meal. Thorne capped his silver inkwell, the metal cold against his palm, a grounding sensation against the turbulence of the last few hours. He packed his quills, wiping the nib clean with a scrap of linen that came away stained black. His fingers were smudged, the skin around his nails darkened by the ink, a mark that would not wash off easily. He looked at his hands, seeing them not as his own, but as tools of the court, instruments that had helped to weave the noose that would eventually tighten around the Earl's neck. He stood, his legs protesting after so long in the chair, and joined the stream of clerks moving towards the door. He did not look back at the bench where Ferrers sat alone, surrounded by the empty space of his isolation. To look would be to acknowledge the humanity of the accused, and Thorne could not afford such a luxury. He had a job to do, and the job required a certain blindness, a willingness to see only the words and not the blood behind them. Outside, the London afternoon awaited, grey and heavy with the promise of rain. The sky was a uniform sheet of cloud, pressing down on the city, trapping the smoke and the smell of the river in the narrow streets. Thorne stepped onto the pavement, the mud sucking at his boots, and pulled his coat tighter against the chill. The noise of the city rushed to meet him, a cacophony of cart wheels, shouting vendors, and the distant tolling of church bells, a stark contrast to the hushed solemnity of the hall he had just left. He walked west, towards Westminster, keeping his eyes on the ground to avoid the puddles. The image of the pistol remained burned into his mind, the dull gleam of the metal, the way it had sat on the table like an accusation. He wondered if the defense could possibly counter such weight, if any words could be found to balance the scale against the tangible evidence of the gun and the dead steward's pointing finger. The odds seemed impossible, the trajectory of the trial already set like a stone thrown from a height. Tonight, he knew, he would not sleep well. He would dream of the ink turning to blood on his sheets, the black stains spreading across the white linen like a wound that would not clot. He would wake with the taste of iron in his mouth, sharp and coppery, as if he had been chewing on a penny. It was a small price to pay, perhaps, for a seat in the gallery of history, but it was a price nonetheless, one that would be collected in the quiet hours before dawn, long before the second day of Thetrial had even begun. Morning light filtered through the high clerestory windows, stripping the shadows from the corners where the night's damp had settled. Thorne pushed open the heavy door of Westminster Hall, the wood groaning under the pressure of his palm. Inside, the air stood still, cooler than the street outside and heavy with the scent of extinguished tallow and old stone. He moved towards the clerk's table, his boots making no sound on the flagstones, though the echo of the city still rang in his ears. A fellow scribe, Mr. Gurney, looked up from a stack of blank folios, his face pale and drawn. "You returned then," Gurney said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the gap between them. "I half expected you to claim a sickness." Thorne set his satchel down, the leather thudding softly against the wood. Sickness offers no shield from the law nor from the paymaster's ledger. "True enough," Gurney dipped a quill, testing the nib against his thumbnail. "Though I hear the Earl did not sleep well. The jailers say he paced until the bells struck 4. Thorne did not answer immediately. He unpacked his own tools, arranging the sand shaker and the knife for trimming quills in a precise line. The ritual grounded him, a small order imposed upon the chaos of the proceeding. He looked towards the dock where Ferrers would stand. It remained empty, a space defined only by the absence of a man. "Did they say what he spoke?" Thorne asked, keeping his eyes on the ink pot. "Ravings, mostly names of dead men and questions about horses that never existed." Leaning forward, Gurney lowered his voice further. "They say the madness runs deeper than the council admits. If he hangs, it will be on a rope soaked in lunacy." Thorne picked up a sheet of paper, feeling the texture of the rag under his fingertips. It was smooth, unblemished, waiting to be stained. He thought of the previous day, of the pistol lying on the table like a dead bird. The memory sat in his stomach, heavy and cold. "Prepare the records for the defense witnesses," Thorne said, his tone flattening into procedure. "The steward will call them within the hour." Gurney nodded, turning back to his work, the scratch of his nib starting up like the chirping of an insect. Thorne smoothed the paper before him, ensuring no crease marred the surface. He needed the page to be perfect. If the words were to be a noose, they must be woven without flaw. The hall began to fill. Peers entered in groups, their ermine robes trailing over the stone floor, whispering amongst themselves as they took their seats. The sound was a low hum, a collective murmur of judgment forming before a single word was spoken. Thorne watched them, noting the way they avoided looking at the dock. They were here to judge a peer, yet they treated the accused as a contagion. Ferrers arrived with the jailers, stepping into the space that waited for him. He wore the same clothes as the day before, but the fabric seemed looser on his frame, hanging off his shoulders. His face was grey, the eyes sunken into the skull, yet he held his head high. He scanned the rows of peers, his gaze lingering on faces that turned away from his. Thorne dipped his quill. The ink welled up, black and viscous. He waited for the steward to take his seat. When the gavel fell, the noise snapped through the room like a whip. "The court is now in session," the crier announced, his voice booming against the vaulted ceiling. Thorne pressed the nib to the paper, the first stroke requiring pressure, a physical commitment to the record. He wrote the date, the numbers forming neatly in the top corner, 17 April. As the ink flowed, darkening the page, he did not think of the man standing 3 yards away. He thought only of the spelling, the grammar, the permanence of the line. "Counsel for the prosecution," the steward said. "You may proceed." Thorne's hand moved across the page, tracking the words as they were spoken. He captured the rhythm of the speech, the pauses, the emphases. It was a transcription of life, reduced to syntax. Ferrers shifted his weight, the sound of his shoe scraping on stone cutting through the lawyer's drone. Thorne did not look up. He kept his eyes on the paper, on the growing block of text that bound the Earl tighter with every sentence. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Thorne paused, his quill hovering above the line. He looked up to see Ferrers staring directly at him. The Earl's eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the clerk's hand. There was no recognition in the gaze, only a hollow intensity. Thorne lowered the quill. He met the stare for a heartbeat, then looked back to the page. He could not afford the connection. To see the man was to acknowledge the death waiting for him. "Mr. Thorne," Gurney whispered, nudging his elbow, "you have missed a clause." Thorne blinked, returning to the text. He saw the gap in the line, the missing words. He squeezed the nib, forcing ink into the space, correcting the error. The blot spread slightly, a small dark eye staring back at him. He dabbed it with sand, blowing the excess away. The prosecution continued, listing the grievances of the steward, John Johnson, while the name hung in the air, repeated until it lost meaning. Johnson, Johnson. It became a drumbeat, a rhythm of accusation, as Johnson echoed once more. Thorne wrote it each time, the pen scratching over the same letters. Ferrers shifted again, restless. "That is not true," he said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's speech. The steward rapped the gavel. "My lord, you will have your turn. For now, you must listen." Ferrers clenched his jaw, the muscle twitching beneath the skin. He looked at the steward, then back to Thorne. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched, tight and brittle. Thorne waited, the quill poised. He knew the Earl wanted to speak, to correct the record before it was set in stone. But the law did not allow for interruption. The record would hold what the court permitted, not necessarily what happened. "Proceed," the steward commanded. The lawyer continued, his voice gaining strength. Thorne wrote, his hand moving automatically. The ink flowed, filling the page, covering the white space until there was no room left for doubt. He felt the weight of the words accumulating, layer upon layer, building a wall between the man and the freedom he sought. Outside, the sky darkened as clouds gathered over the river. The light in the hall dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. The dust particles swirled in the gloom, dancing in the draught from the open doors. Thorne watched them for a moment, mesmerized by their aimless movement. They settled on the page, on the fresh ink, becoming part of the record. He brushed them away, but the stain remained. The ink had soaked into the fiber, permanent and unchangeable. He looked at Ferrers, who stood still now, resigned to the flow of the testimony. The Earl's hands hung at his sides, limp and useless. Thorne turned the page. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He started a new sheet, the paper crisp and white. He wrote the heading, the date, the names. He prepared to capture the next hour, the next lie, the next truth. The quill felt heavy in his hand, weighted with the ink of the court. Gurney leaned close again, his breath smelling of stale bread. "He looks finished," he murmured. "Do you not think so?" Thorne did not answer. He pressed the nib down, starting the first word of the new page. The ink bled into the paper, dark and final. He kept writing, ignoring the man in the dock, ignoring the shadow falling across his desk. The record demanded everything, and he would give it nothing less than the whole of the tragedy, written in a hand that refused to tremble. The scratch of the nib ceased, not from lack of ink, but because the words running through Thorne's head had stalled against the sheer bulk of the accusation. Gurney's question about the Earl's finished state hung in the damp air, a useless inquiry when the law cared nothing for appearance, only for the proven act. Thorne ignored the query, focusing instead on the way the light from the high windows struck the silver inkwell, turning the metal into a cold, unblinking eye that watched the proceedings with indifference. He dipped the quill again, the feather brushing his knuckle with a dry whisper, and forced the nib to bite into the fresh sheet. The deceased was struck whilst attempting to retrieve the papers from the desk. The prosecutor droned, his voice flat and devoid of the violence he described. Thorne wrote desk, the letters looping tight, feeling the resistance of the paper as if it was skin. Ferrers shifted his stance, the heel of his polished shoe grinding against the stone floor with a sound like a bone snapping. It was a small noise, easily lost beneath the lawyer's recitation, yet it made Thorne's hand jerk, leaving a jagged tear in the margin of the record. He stared at the rip, a white wound in the black text, and felt a sudden, irrational urge to cover it with his sleeve. "My Lord Ferrers," the steward intoned, his voice dropping an octave to command attention without raising volume. "You are reminded that your conduct must remain becoming of your station." Ferrers did not bow. He stood rigid, his chest heaving beneath the velvet of his coat, the fabric straining against a breath held too long. "My station," the Earl said, the words cracking slightly before gaining strength, "is that of a man accused of killing his own servant, yet I am treated as a beast in a cage." "The court determines the nature of the trial, not the accused," the steward replied, tapping the gavel once, a sharp report that echoed off the timbered walls. Thorne captured the exchange, his handwriting speeding up to match the rising tension, the script becoming less ornate, more hurried. He noted the tremor in Ferrers' left hand, the way the fingers curled into a fist and then released over and over, a mechanical spasm that suggested a mind unraveling under the weight of scrutiny. It was not the rage of a murderer, Thorne thought, but the panic of a child lost in a forest of rules he could not comprehend. The prosecutor moved on to the weapon, the pistol that had ended John Johnson's life, describing it with a clinical detachment that made the violence seem sterile, manageable. The pistol was loaded with ball and powder, found still warm in the prisoner's hand, the lawyer stated, turning to face the peers who sat in their rows of crimson and ermine. Ferrers laughed, a short, barking sound that held no humor. "Warm, it was cold as the grave before they took it from me. They speak of time as if it bends to their convenience." "Record the outburst," the steward ordered, his eyes fixed on the clerk's desk. Thorne wrote the words outburst and convenience, feeling the absurdity of reducing a man's unraveling to mere vocabulary. The dust motes continued their slow dance in the shafts of light, settling on the shoulders of the peers, on the polished wood of the bench, and on the dark coat of the accused, binding them all in a shared layer of grime. Thorne brushed a speck from his own cuff, watching it fall to join the others on the floor, wondering how long it would take for the dust of this day to settle on the memory of those present. Probably not long. Men forgot the details of death quickly, especially when it was sanctioned by law. "Did the deceased offer resistance?" the prosecutor asked, addressing a witness who had not yet been called, a rhetorical flourish designed to paint Johnson as helpless. "There was no resistance," Ferrers shouted, stepping forward until the chain at his ankle rattled, a harsh metallic counterpoint to the soft voices of the court. "He stood there, looking at me with those eyes, and I could not stop the hand." The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, stripping away the legal pretense to reveal the raw, bloody core of the event. Thorne's quill hovered, the ink pooling at the tip, threatening to drop a black tear onto the page before he could move. He looked at Ferrers, really looked at him, and saw not a peer of the realm, but a man standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the wind to push him over. The Earl's face was flushed, the veins in his neck standing out like cords, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Sit down, my lord," the steward commanded, his patience wearing thin like an old garment. "You will have your opportunity to address the court in your defense." "I am speaking now," Ferrers insisted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and despair. "Before you write it down wrong, before you make it into something it is not." Thorne felt the weight of the expectation pressing down on his shoulders, the demand to capture this moment perfectly, to freeze the chaos in ink. He pressed the nib to the paper, the scratch loud in the sudden quiet of the room. He wrote the words, "I could not stop the hand," knowing that someday somewhere, someone would read those words and judge a life based on the curve of his letters. The responsibility was a physical burden, a stone in his gut that made it hard to breathe. "The witness will describe the scene," the prosecutor said, ignoring the Earl's plea, steamrolling over the human element with the momentum of the procedure. Ferrers slumped back against the rail, the energy draining from him as quickly as it had surged. He looked at Thorne again, and this time there was a question in his eyes, a silent plea for understanding that the clerk could not answer. Thorne looked away, focusing on the line of text, on the perfect alignment of the words, seeking refuge in the order of the script. He could not save the man, he could only record the falling. Gurney shifted beside him, the wood of the bench creaking under his weight. "He's digging his own grave with that tongue," the older clerk muttered, barely moving his lips. "Best let him hang himself before we have to write the epitaph." Thorne did not respond. He dipped the quill into the silver well, the cold metal biting into his fingertip, and continued to write. The ink flowed, black and relentless, covering the white space, filling the gaps, building the wall higher with every stroke. Outside, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the river, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of his shoes. The storm was coming, inevitable and unstoppable, much like the verdict that waited at the end of this long, dark day. Thorne kept writing, the scratch of the nib the only sound he allowed himself to hear, drowning out the thunder, the whispers, and the ragged breathing of the condemned man. The thunder outside did not break. It merely grumbled, a distant beast pacing the roof of Westminster Hall, while the air inside grew thick enough to chew. Thorne's wrist ached, a dull throb radiating from the bone where the quill shaft dug in, yet he forced the nib to dance across the parchment, chasing the prosecutor's next question before the Earl could interrupt again. "Describe the position of the body," the lawyer demanded, his voice smooth as oiled leather, stripping the tragedy of its heat until only the mechanics remained. Ferrers stirred. The chain at his ankle clicked, a single sharp note that cut through the murmuring of the peers. He did not rise this time, but leaned forward, gripping the wooden rail until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. "He was not a body then," the Earl said, his voice dropping to a register that forced every man in the room to lean in to catch the words. "He was John. He was the man who brought me my coffee every morning for 10 years. He was the man who taught my daughter to ride." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crimson rows, a shifting of ermine and silk, as the lords adjusted their weight, unwilling to bear the burden of such intimacy. The steward tapped his gavel, the sound dry and final, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. "Stick to the facts, my lord. The court requires the geometry of the scene, not a eulogy." Attempt 1, mental outline. "Geometry," Ferrers laughed, though the sound was brittle and cracked halfway through. "You want angles, you want degrees. Too many short questions in a row, maybe combine. Let's look at the dialogue tags and action." Thorne wrote 3 paces, the ink flowing dark and wet, swallowing the white space. He felt the lie of it in his fingers, for the distance mattered less than the intent, yet the law cared only for the measurement. It was a cold arithmetic, adding up steps and seconds while ignoring the storm that had broken inside the man's head. Gurney beside him shifted again, the scent of stale tobacco and old wool rising from his coat, a grounding smell in a room spinning with madness. "Did the victim speak?" the prosecutor pressed, relentless as a tide coming in. "He asked if I was well," Ferrers whispered, and the sudden softness was more terrifying than his shouting. "He asked if I was well when he could see the world ending behind my eyes, and I shot him." The admission landed with a heavy finality, silencing the rustle of robes and the scratching of other quills. Thorne paused, his hand hovering over the page, the ink pooling once more at the tip of his nib, threatening to spill. He looked up, unable to stop himself, and caught the Earl's gaze. For a heartbeat, the chaos in those eyes cleared, replaced by a lucidity so sharp it felt like a blade. Ferrers mouthed a word, silent and deliberate, shaping it with lips that had just confessed to murder. "Forgive." The word hung there, unrecorded, invisible to the law but searing itself into Thorne's memory. It was not a plea for the court, nor for the king, but for the man with the quill, the scribe who would turn this messy, bleeding moment into clean, permanent history. Thorne felt a coldness spread through his chest, distinct from the damp chill of the hall, a realization that he was not merely witnessing a death, but officiating it. His pen was the executioner's axe, and every word he set down tightened the noose. "Record the confession," the steward ordered, his face impassive, a mask of judicial neutrality that hid whatever horror he might feel. Word for word. Thorne lowered his gaze. He could not hold the Earl's eyes any longer, not while he committed this act of betrayal. He pressed the nib to the paper and wrote, "I shot him," the letters forming with a precision that felt obscene. The scratch of the nib sounded louder now, a tearing noise, as if he were ripping the flesh of the page rather than marking it. Outside, the thunder rolled again, closer this time, shaking the high windows in their frames, but inside, the only storm was the one raging in the silence between the lines. "He was a good servant," Ferrers added, his voice trembling again, the moment of clarity passing like a cloud over the sun. "He did nothing wrong, nothing at all." "The court has heard enough regarding the character of the deceased," the prosecutor interrupted, turning his back on the Earl as if he were already gone. "Call the next witness, Mr. Allen, if you please." The machinery of the trial ground forward, indifferent to the wreckage it left in its wake. A man in a somber coat stepped forward, swore an oath, and began to speak of ballistics and wound trajectories, his voice monotone and dull. Thorne listened with only half an ear, his mind fixed on the unspoken word that still burned in the air. "Forgive." He dipped his quill into the silver well, the metal cold against his skin, and tried to focus on the testimony about powder burns and entry angles. But the ink seemed thicker now, sluggish, resisting the flow as if it too understood the weight of what was being done. Gurney nudged his elbow, a sharp, painful jab that demanded attention. "Keep up, boy," he hissed, his eyes remaining fixed on the witness, "because you are missing the trajectory, and the Lords will want that exact." Thorne blinked, forcing his hand to move, to capture the sterile details of death. He wrote ball entered left chest, exit wound right shoulder, distance estimated at 1 yard. The words piled up, a wall of text that buried the human reality beneath layers of legal procedure. Yet in the margin of his mind, the Earl's silent plea echoed, a ghost that no amount of ink could exorcise. The dust motes danced on, swirling in the shafts of grey light, settling on the shoulders of the witness, the prosecutor, and the clerk, binding them all in the same grey shroud. The witness droned on, detailing the path of the bullet as if tracing a map on a table, devoid of blood or pain. Ferrers sat motionless, his head bowed, looking smaller than he had moments before, stripped of his rage and left with only a terrible, hollow resignation. The chain at his ankle lay still, a dead weight on the floorboards. Thorne watched the Earl's hands, resting on the rail, trembling slightly, the fingers curling and uncurling in that same mechanical spasm. It was the movement of a man trying to grasp something that had already slipped away, something intangible and lost. "And the pistol?" the prosecutor asked, seizing on a detail. "Was it primed?" "It was," the witness confirmed, "ready to fire." "Objection," Ferrers murmured, though he lacked the strength to raise his voice. "It was always ready, that was the point." No one acknowledged him. The question hung in the air, answered and dismissed, another brick laid in the foundation of the verdict. Thorne wrote the words down, his handwriting steady now, perfected by the numbness that had taken hold of his limbs. He was becoming part of the machine, a cog greased with ink and silence. The thunder outside finally broke, a crash of rain lashing against the glass, drowning out the witness's voice for a brief second. But the writing continued, unstoppable, the ink bleeding into the paper, a permanent stain that would outlast the rain, the storm, and the man who sat waiting for the end. Thorne finished the line, the period a small black circle that sealed the fate of the sentence. He lifted the quill, watching a single drop of ink fall from the nib to the desk, spreading slowly into the wood grain. It looked like blood, just a drop, but enough to mark the surface forever. He wiped it away with his thumb, the stain transferring to his skin, a dark smudge that he knew would not wash off easily. The trial moved on, the voices rising and falling in a rhythm that felt ancient and inevitable, but Thorne sat frozen, staring at the smear on his thumb, wondering if the ink would ever leave him, or if he would carry this mark until his own reckoning came. The steward's gavel struck again, signaling the end of the witness's testimony, and the sound echoed through the hall like a closing door. Ferrers lifted his head, his eyes finding Thorne's once more, but this time there was no plea, only a quiet, terrible acceptance. The silent word had been spoken, heard, and ignored, lost in the vast, uncaring archive of the law. Thorne dipped his quill again, the silver well reflecting the grey light of the storm, and prepared to write the next line of the death warrant, his hand moving before his heart could protest. The ink flowed, black and endless, and the page filled up, row by row, with the truth that no one wanted to hear. Rain lashed the high panes, a relentless drumming that turned the afternoon light to a bruised grey, yet inside Westminster Hall the air remained still and thick, with the smell of wet wool and old timber. Thorne wiped the smudge from his thumb, but the black mark had already sunk into the whorls of his skin, a permanent brand of the proceeding. He reached for the sand shaker, his hand shaking just enough to spill a coarse drift over the fresh line, the grains catching the light like crushed glass before he brushed them away with a sleeve. "Next witness," the Lord High Steward commanded, his voice flat and devoid of the fatigue that sagged in every other shoulder in the room. A clerk shuffled forward, dragging a heavy ledger that scraped against the oak table, a sound like a bone being pulled from mud. Thorne watched the man's lips move, forming names and dates that meant nothing to the blood soaking into the floorboards 3 days prior. The Earl did not look up. Ferrers stared at his own hands, resting on the bar, fingers twitching in that same rhythmic spasm, curling and uncurling, as if testing the air for the reins of horses that no longer existed. "My lord," the prosecutor began, stepping into the pool of grey light, his wig powdered so thickly it looked like a mask of plaster. "We turn now to the matter of the steward's character. Did Mr. Johnson ever withhold wages?" "He did not," Ferrers said, the words dropping into the silence without rising in pitch, "for he was honest, too honest for his own good." "Then why the dispute over the accounts?" "Because he lied about the horses." Ferrers lifted his head, eyes burning with a sudden, feverish clarity that made the surrounding peers shift uncomfortably on their woolpacks. "He said they were lame. I saw them run. I saw them in the field, galloping free while he told me they could not pull the cart." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a low hum of confusion at the mention of beasts long sold or dead. Thorne's quill hovered, the nib trembling above the parchment. He knew the record required only the facts of the shooting, not the delusions that preceded it, yet the law demanded he capture every syllable spoken at the bar. To omit the madness was to falsify the trial, to include it was to paint a portrait of a lunatic rather than a murderer. "Write it down," Gurney whispered, leaning close enough that Thorne could smell the sour wine on his breath. "Every word. Let them hear how far gone he is." Thorne pressed the nib to the page, the ink flowing dark and viscous, mirroring the thick confusion in his own gut. He wrote, "The accused speaks of horses unseen," the letters tight and cramped, a visual representation of the shrinking mind behind them. The scratching of the pen sounded loud in the lull between questions, a tiny, frantic noise against the vast, silent judgment of the room. "And these horses," the prosecutor pressed, circling the Earl like a shark testing the water, "where are they now, my lord?" "Gone," Ferrers replied, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "Sold, or perhaps stolen. Johnson took them. He took everything." "There is no record of sale, my lord, no bill of exchange, no witness to the transaction." "Because he hid it." Ferrers slammed a hand against the rail, the sudden violence making the nearest peer recoil, ermine robes rustling in alarm. "He is a thief, a liar who stole my dignity along with my stock." The outburst hung in the air, raw and jagged, stripping away the veneer of aristocratic composure Ferrers had struggled to maintain since Monday. Thorne watched the Earl's chest heave, the fine black cloth of his coat straining against the rapid rise and fall of his breathing. It was a terrible thing to witness, the unraveling of a man who believed his own fiction so completely that the truth appeared as the enemy. The dust motes swirled around Ferrers' head, catching the dim light, looking for all the world like the spirits of the missing animals haunting his final hours. "Order," the steward rapped, the gavel striking wood with a sharp, final crack. "My Lord Ferrers, you will address the court with civility, or you will be silenced." Ferrers flinched as if struck, the anger draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only a hollowed-out shell. He slumped against the bar, shoulders rounding, the fight extinguished by the rigid indifference of the procedure. "I beg pardon," he murmured, barely audible. "The heat, it confuses me." "There is no heat, my lord," the prosecutor said coldly, turning back to the ledger. "Only the facts, and the facts state that John Johnson was a faithful servant until the moment you placed the pistol to his chest." Thorne wrote the words, feeling each one land like a stone in his stomach. Faithful servant, pistol to chest. The phrase was sterile, clean of the blood and the scream and the way Johnson's body had crumpled onto the pantry floor. He wanted to stop, to lay down the quill and declare that the record was a lie because it lacked the smell of gunpowder and the terror in the room, but Gurney's elbow waited, a silent threat of professional ruin. The machine required fuel, and Thorne was the feeder. "Did the deceased threaten you?" the prosecutor asked, moving towards the conclusion of this line of questioning. "He threatened my peace," Ferrers whispered, looking at his hands again. "He said the horses were dead. He knew they were dead, and he told me anyway, just to hurt me." "No further questions," the prosecutor announced, stepping back into the shadows of the peerage. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, laden with the unspoken verdict that hung above them all like a blade waiting to drop. Thorne lifted his quill, the nib dry now, and waited for the next instruction, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that had nothing to do with the law. He looked at the Earl, expecting to see rage or defiance, but found only a profound, terrifying exhaustion. Ferrers met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, the madness cleared, replaced by a lucid horror that acknowledged the trap closing tight. In that look, Thorne saw the silent word again, not forgive this time, but remember. Remember the horses, remember the lie, remember that the law cares nothing for the truth of a broken mind, only the order of the transcript. Thorne blinked, breaking the connection, and dipped his pen into the silver well, the cold metal biting into his fingers. He had to write the next line, the next fact, the next step towards the gallows, because the ink would not wait for mercy. The rain continued to beat against the glass, a steady, drowning roar that masked the sound of the quill scratching out the final remnants of Laurence Shirley's life, one precise, damning word at a time. "Call the next witness," the steward commanded, his voice stripping the warmth from the room as effectively as the draft creeping under the doors. Gurney shifted in his seat, the leather of his breeches creaking a dry, protesting sound that seemed unnaturally loud against the sudden stillness. He did not look at Thorne, instead tapping a finger against the stack of depositions as if testing the ripeness of fruit. "Mr. William Alder," Gurney announced, turning slightly to address the usher standing by the heavy oak doors. "Bring him forward." The doors groaned open, admitting a gust of damp air that smelled of wet wool and the river mud clinging to the streets outside. A man entered, small and stooped, wearing a coat that had seen better decades, let alone better days. He walked with a limp that dragged his left foot across the stone floor, a rhythmic scuff drag that counted out the seconds until he reached the bar. Thorne's hand cramped, the muscles in his forearm tightening into a hard knot that threatened to snap the quill's shaft. He forced his fingers to relax, pressing his thumb against the feathered end of the pen until the pain distracted him from the trembling in his gut. The ink in the silver well had settled into a dark, mirror-like pool, reflecting the gray light of the windows, but giving nothing back. "State your name and occupation," the prosecutor said, not unkindly, though his eyes remained fixed on the ledger before him. "William Alder, sir," the man replied, his voice thin and reedy, like wind whistling through a crack in a windowpane. I am a journeyman carpenter, formerly employed by the Earl at Staunton Harold. Alder kept his eyes on the floorboards, avoiding the gaze of the peers who sat elevated in their rows, their ermine collars forming a sea of spotted white against the dark wood of the benches. He looked like a man who wished he were anywhere else, perhaps back in the safety of the carpentry shop where wood behaved predictably and did not demand answers about bloodshed. Did you reside in the Earl's household on the 16th day of January last? I did, sir, in the servants' quarters above the stables. And were you present in the house when the deceased, John Johnson, was shot? Alder flinched, the name striking him physically. He lifted his head for the first time, his eyes darting towards Ferrers before shrinking away as if burned. I was in the yard, sir, shaving a beam for the new carriage house. Did you hear the discharge? Yes, sir, loud, like a cannon in the close space of the yard. And what did you do then? I ran inside, sir, through the kitchen where everyone was shouting. Alder swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat gone dry. I saw the master standing over Mr. Johnson, the pistol still in his hand. Thorne's nib scratched across the parchment, the sound harsh and grating. I saw the master standing over Mr. Johnson. The words formed a picture so vivid it made his stomach turn. He could smell the phantom scent of burnt powder, acrid and choking, mixing with the metallic tang of fresh blood that must have coated the pantry tiles. It was a smell that never truly washed away, he suspected, no matter how much lye soap one used. Describe the manner of the accused, the prosecutor pressed, leaning forward slightly, his shadow stretching across the table to touch Thorne's writing hand. Was he calm? Was he raving? Alder hesitated, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. The fabric was worn thin, frayed at the edges where his thumbs rubbed against it nervously. He was quiet, sir, too quiet. He just stood there looking down, as if he were inspecting a piece of joinery that had gone wrong. Did he speak? He said. Alder's voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the court to lean in to catch the testimony. He said, "You have ruined me, Johnson. Now you shall pay for it." Ferrers stirred at the bar, a low noise escaping his throat that might have been a groan or a protest. He gripped the rail, his knuckles white against the dark wood, but he did not turn to look at the witness. His gaze remained fixed on some point in the middle distance, seeing perhaps the horses that no one else could see or the ghosts of the past that had driven him to this precipice. And the deceased, the prosecutor asked, relentless in his pursuit of the narrative arc that led inevitably to the gallows. Did he respond? No, sir, he was on the floor, making a sound like a bird with a broken wing, though no words came. Alder shook his head in a quick, jerky motion. He died before the surgeon could arrive, and I saw the blood pooling around him as it spread very fast. Thorne stopped writing. The ink pooled at the end of his last stroke, a dark bead threatening to drop and ruin the line. He held his breath, waiting for the drop to fall, for the mistake to stain the record permanently, but he managed to lift the quill just in time. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. It spread very fast. The phrase hung in the room, heavier than the dust motes, heavier than the silence. It was a simple observation, devoid of legal jargon or aristocratic pretense, yet it carried the weight of the entire tragedy. Blood did not care about peerages or trials. It simply spread, consuming the space around it until nothing else mattered. "Thank you, Mr. Alder," the prosecutor said, sitting back and making a note on his own paper. "You may step down." Alder bowed clumsily, nearly tripping over his own feet as he turned to leave. The scuff drag of his foot resumed, a mournful rhythm accompanying his retreat from the bar. He disappeared through the heavy doors, leaving behind the scent of sawdust and fear that clung to his clothes. The court sat in a suspended animation, the peers shifting uncomfortably as the reality of the violence intruded upon their ceremonial duty. Some adjusted their wigs, others stared at their hands, unable to meet the eyes of their neighbors. The opulence of the hall, the gold leaf and the carved wood, seemed suddenly garish, a grotesque backdrop for the recitation of such sordid details. Thorne dipped his pen again, the silver rim cold against his fingertip. He had to capture the next question, the next answer, the next step in the machinery that was grinding the Earl down to dust. There was no pause for mercy, no break in the procedure to allow for the human cost to be acknowledged. The law moved forward with the inevitability of a tide, washing away nuance and leaving only the stark facts of guilt and innocence. "Call Mr. Thomas," Gurney said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. Another name, another witness, another layer of earth piled onto the grave that was being dug with words. Thorne looked at Ferrers. The Earl had closed his eyes, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. The madness had receded again, leaving behind a clarity that was far more terrible. He knew what was coming. He knew that every word spoken in this hall was sealing his fate, turning the possibility of mercy into a distant, unreachable dream. The quill touched the paper. The ink flowed. The record grew longer, a snake of black marks coiling around the life of a man who had once been powerful enough to command armies, now reduced to a defendant standing before his peers, waiting for the end. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the glass in a frenzied rhythm that matched the pounding in Thorne's head. The sound was a constant reminder of the world beyond the hall, a world that continued regardless of the verdict rendered within these walls. Life went on for everyone except John Johnson, and soon, perhaps, for Laurence Shirley as well. "Mr. Thomas," the usher called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. The doors opened again. Another figure stepped into the light, carrying with him another story, another piece of the puzzle that would ultimately form a picture of death. Thorne tightened his grip on the quill, preparing to write it all down, to bear witness to the destruction of a soul with nothing but ink and paper. The next chapter of the reckoning was about to begin. The doors groaned on their iron hinges, admitting a man who smelled of tobacco and the sharp, acrid tang of gunpowder that clung to fabric long after the shot. Thomas did not bow. He stood before the bar with the stiff posture of a servant who had seen too much and spoken too little, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. Gurney rose from his seat, the rustle of his silk gown cutting through the low murmur of the peers. "State your name and occupation for the court." "William Thomas, I am valet to his lordship." "You attended the Earl on the day of the incident." "I did." "Describe the weapon." Thomas swallowed, the bob of his throat visible above the stiff stock of his cravat. He looked not at the prosecutor, but at Ferrers, whose gaze remained fixed on the opposite wall, unblinking. "A pistol, sir, single barrel, silver mounted." "Was it loaded?" "It was always loaded. His lordship carried it for protection against the horses." A ripple of unease passed through the woolpacks. Whispers died as quickly as they were born, strangled by the weight of the accusation. Thorne pressed the nib to the parchment, the scratch of the point sounding loud in the sudden stillness. He wrote pistol, the letters forming a neat, black row that belied the violence of the object. Ink soaked into the fiber, permanent and unforgiving. "Did you see the pistol on the day in question?" Gurney pressed, stepping closer to the witness box. "Yes, sir, on the table, in the study." "Was it fired?" Thomas hesitated. His eyes flicked to the Lord High Steward, then back to the floor. "I found it smoking, sir, after Mr. Johnson fell." "Describe the condition of the barrel." Thorne's wrist ached. He shifted the paper slightly, aligning the margin with the edge of the table. The silver inkwell sat to his right, cold and heavy, an anchor in the shifting tide of testimony. He waited for the description, ready to capture every flaw, every mark that might speak to the state of the Earl's mind. "There was a mark, sir, on the steel." "What manner of mark?" "A scratch deep near the trigger guard." Thomas lifted a hand, miming the shape in the air, his fingers tracing a line that no one else could see. It looked fresh, as if it had been struck against something hard. Gurney paused, the silence stretched, thin and brittle, before he turned away from the witness. "Did the Earl speak to you about this scratch?" "No, sir." "Did he speak to you at all?" Thomas shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the stone as he moved. "He told me to clean it," he said, his voice low, "to make it ready again." "For what purpose?" He said the horses were still coming. Ferrers flinched, a visible jerk of the shoulder as if struck by a physical blow. He turned his head slowly, eyes finding Thomas for the first time. There was no recognition in the look, only a hollow surprise, as though he could not recall giving such an order. Thorne watched the Earl's lips move. No sound emerged, yet the shape of a word formed there, sharp and silent. Liar, or perhaps mercy. The angle of the mouth obscured the truth. "Objection," Ferrers said, his voice rough and unused as he declared, "He misremembers." The Lord High Steward rapped the gavel. The sound cracked like a whip. "My lord, you will have your turn. Proceed, Mr. Gurney." Gurney smiled, a thin stretching of skin that did not reach his eyes. "You may step down, Mr. Thomas." Thomas bowed, this time with more grace, and retreated into the shadows of the gallery. The scent of powder lingered in his wake, mixing with the stale air of the hall. Thorne looked down at his page. The word scratch sat there, isolated among the legal formalities. He dipped the quill again, the ink rising dark and viscous. He hovered over the paper. To record the scratch was to acknowledge a detail that suggested premeditation, a weapon maintained for violence rather than defense. To omit it was to sanitize the record, to leave the pistol as a mere prop in a tragedy rather than the instrument of death. The clock outside ticked. 1 second, 2. The rhythm measured out the time remaining to the Earl, each beat a nail driven into the coffin of his acquittal. Thorne wrote the word. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he scraped the nib back over the ink, blotting the line with sand before the fluid could dry. The black smear covered the detail, leaving only a smudge where the truth had been. He told himself it was an error in transcription, a mistake of the hand. The lie tasted like copper in his mouth. "Call Mr. Bates," Gurney said, not looking at the clerk. The next witness stepped forward, a surgeon with blood still under his fingernails despite the washing. Thorne smoothed the parchment, flattening the wrinkled spot where the ink had been erased. The fiber was damaged, weakened by the abrasion. It would tear easily if handled too roughly. He looked at Ferrers. The Earl had closed his eyes again, his head bowed as if in prayer. The madness had returned, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the weight of the peerage crushing him down into the floorboards. He stood alone at the bar, surrounded by men who would soon vote on his life, isolated by the very rank that was supposed to protect him. Thorne turned the page. The fresh sheet smelled of linen and bleach, clean and untouched. He arranged the quills once more, selecting a fresh nib from the pot. The metal was cold against his thumb. He needed to be ready for the surgeon's report, for the clinical dissection of the body that would follow the dissection of the soul. The prosecutor leaned towards the new witness, his voice dropping to a murmur that forced the court to lean in. Thorne adjusted the inkwell, ensuring it sat perfectly square on the table. Precision was his only defense now. If the record was flawless, perhaps the guilt would not stick to him. Perhaps he could remain a vessel, empty and clean, while the ink did the killing. But the smudge on the previous page stared back at him, a dark eye accusing him of complicity. He had altered the record. Not much, only a scratch, but the integrity of the transcript was broken. The law demanded absolute truth, yet here he sat, sanding away the rough edges to make the narrative smoother. "Describe the wound," Gurney commanded. Thorne pressed the nib down. The ink flowed. He did not look at the smudge. He focused on the new line, the new lie, the new step towards the gallows. The clock ticked on, indifferent to the stain on the paper or the soul of the scribe. Outside, the sky darkened, though the candles in the hall remained lit, their flames trembling in the draught. The light flickered across Ferrers' face, casting deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. He looked older than he had in the morning, the years piling up with every question asked. Thorne wrote the surgeon's words: entry wound, left side, downward trajectory. Although the language remained sterile and clean of blood, it turned a man's death into a geometric problem. He finished the line and lifted the quill, waiting for the next instruction, when his hand shook, just once, a tremor that threatened to ruin the next letter. He steadied it against the edge of the desk. The trial moved forward, relentless and hungry. There would be no pause for reflection, no moment to scrub the ink from his hands and walk away. He was bound to the desk, to the well, to the man at the bar. The next witness was already speaking, his voice weaving another thread into the noose. Thorne dipped the pen. The ink was running low. He would need to refill the well soon. Morning light strained through the high clerestory windows, pale and watery, doing little to warm the stone floor where the peers would soon tread. Elias Thorne sat at the same scarred table, though the parchment before him was fresh, untouched by the smudges of yesterday's cowardice. He arranged the quills in a row, feathers aligned like soldiers awaiting inspection, yet his fingers lingered on the wood, grain rather than the tools. The hall smelled of damp wool and extinguished tallow, a cold scent that settled in the lungs and refused to shift. A clerk from the Commons brushed past, shoulder-checking Thorne's arm without apology. "Make space," the man muttered, carrying a stack of briefs bound in red tape. "The Lords will be upon us before the bell." Thorne nodded, shifting his elbow inward, reclaiming the scant territory required for his work. He reached for the sand pot, shaking a fine layer over the desk to catch any spills, though the vessel remained dry. It was a ritual of readiness, a physical prayer that the day might proceed without error. Yesterday's blot remained hidden beneath the top sheet of his stack, buried where only he knew to dig. The memory of that scraped ink felt like a splinter under the nail, invisible but throbbing whenever the hand closed. Footsteps echoed from the corridor, heavy and measured, signaling the approach of the procession. Thorne straightened his spine, locking the vertebrae into a rigid line that betrayed none of the tremor in his gut. He would not look at the prisoner until the Earl was secured at the bar. To meet the eye now, before the formalities began, felt like an admission of shared guilt. The air grew heavier as the peers filed in, their ermine robes brushing against the wood of the benches with a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. They took their seats, a sea of red and fur, faces set in masks of solemn duty that concealed the hunger for conclusion. "Bring the prisoner," the Lord High Steward commanded. The voice boomed across the hall, striking the rafters and returning as a dull thunder. Ferrers entered not with the defiance of the previous day, but with a shuffled gait that suggested his boots were filled with lead. He wore the same morning black, though the fabric looked worn at the cuffs, frayed by the rubbing of shackles hidden beneath. His eyes scanned the room, darting from face to face, searching for an ally among men who had already judged him. Finding none, he fixed his gaze on the floorboards, counting the steps to the bar. Thorne picked up the quill. The nib hovered above the page, poised to capture the final words of the living man. "Laurence Shirley, Earl Ferrers," the Clerk of the Crown announced, his tone devoid of inflection. "You stand upon your trial for high murder. What say you, guilty or not guilty?" Ferrers lifted his head. The movement was jerky, as if the neck muscles struggled against the weight of the skull. "Not guilty," he whispered. The word barely carried 3 feet before dissolving into the silence of the hall. Thorne wrote it down, the scratch of the nib loud in the quiet room. He formed the letters carefully, ensuring the loop of the G did not touch the line below. Precision was the only armor left. If the record was perfect, the morality of the outcome belonged to the peers, not the scribe. He told himself this lie again, swallowing it like medicine that offered no cure. The prosecution rose to summarize the evidence, a recapitulation of the violence done to John Johnson. Thorne listened without hearing, focusing instead on the flow of ink from the pot. The fluid was darker today, thicker, clinging to the steel as if reluctant to leave the vessel. It stained the paper with a permanence that frightened him. Every word recorded was a nail driven into the coffin, and he held the hammer. "His lordship was heard to threaten the deceased on multiple occasions," the prosecutor said, turning towards the peers. "The malice was premeditated, calculated, and executed with a pistol kept ready for the purpose." Ferrers shifted his weight. The chains beneath his coat rattled, a sharp metallic chime that cut through the lawyer's drone. "Horses," Ferrers said. The steward leaned forward, his expression tightening. "My lord." "The horses," Ferrers repeated, his voice gaining strength, rising to a pitch that bordered on shouting. "They are not ready. The carriage cannot leave without the team." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled by the ushers. Thorne's hand paused. The instruction was to record all spoken words, even delusions. To omit them was to falsify the history of the mind. Yet to write them was to cement the madness that would seal the verdict. He looked at the Earl. The man was not speaking to the court anymore. He was addressing a phantom coachman, eyes wide and unseeing. "Record it," the steward said, his voice cold. "Transcribe the outburst." Thorne dipped the quill. The ink touched the page. "The horses are not ready." He wrote the words, feeling the truth of them curdle in his stomach. They were not true. There were no horses. There was only the rope waiting at Tyburn. By writing the delusion, he was certifying the insanity that would deny the Earl a beheading. The pen moved across the fibre, tearing slightly where the sand had been too rough yesterday. The paper resisted. Ferrers grabbed the bar. His knuckles turned white against the dark wood. "I demand the carriage," he shouted, the veneer of aristocratic control shattering completely. "You cannot hang a peer like a common felon. The law forbids it." "The court will decide the manner of execution," the steward replied, unmoved by the plea. "Proceed with the summary." Thorne watched the Earl's hands. They trembled now, a visible palsy that had not been present on the first day. The volatility was complete. The man who had entered with dignity was gone, replaced by a frightened animal cornered by procedure. Thorne felt a sudden urge to scratch out the line about the horses, to sand it away as he had done with the pistol's scratch. He pressed the nib harder, embedding the ink deep into the pulp. No correction would come. This stain was intended. The prosecutor continued, his voice weaving the noose tighter with every sentence. Thorne transcribed the rhythm of the condemnation, the rise and fall of the voice that demanded death. He did not look at Ferrers again. To look would be to acknowledge the humanity being stripped away layer by layer. He focused on the letters, the loops, the dots. The technicalities of the script became a shield against the horror of the content. Outside, the clock tower struck the hour, its sound vibrating through the stone walls as a physical pulse that marked the erosion of time. Each chime was a second lost, a moment of life burned away in the cold air of the hall. Thorne counted the strokes. 11. Since the session would end soon, the peers would retire to deliberate. "Is there anything further?" the steward asked, looking down at the prisoner. Ferrers stood silent. His chest heaved, the black cloth of his coat rising and falling rapidly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words had deserted him, or perhaps he finally understood that none remained to be spoken. He bowed his head, the posture of a man accepting the weight of the yoke. "Clear the court," the steward ordered. "The peers will convene to determine the verdict." Chairs scraped against the floor. The rustle of robes filled the space as the nobility rose to withdraw. Thorne remained seated, his hand resting on the page where the delusion sat dried and black. He could not leave yet. The record required signing. He reached for the sand pot again, intending to dry the final line, but his hand hovered over the vessel. The ink was still wet. It glistened under the weak light, a fresh wound on the paper. "Mr. Thorne." He started, looking up to find the Lord High Steward standing over him. The man held his hat in one hand, the ermine trim brushing against Thorne's elbow. "Ensure the transcript is sealed by noon," the steward said. "The king expects the record before the execution." "It will be done," Thorne replied. The steward nodded, turning to follow the peers. Thorne watched him go, then looked back at the page. The words, "the horses are not ready," stared up at him. He blew gently across the ink, watching the sheen dull as it dried. The truth was gone. Only the record remained. He reached for the sealing wax. The stick was red, hard as dried blood. Thorne rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the ridges where the knife had shaved the end flat. He needed heat. The brazier in the corner had gone dull, glowing only in the deep center where the coals hugged each other for warmth. A draft swept through the hall, carrying the scent of wet wool and the fading perfume of the peers who had just departed. It chilled his knuckles. "Need a light, Mr. Thorne." An usher stood nearby, holding a taper that smoked gently in the gloom. The man's livery was frayed at the cuff, grey thread unraveling against the dark fabric. Thorne nodded, unable to trust his voice just then. He pushed the parchment forward, aligning the bottom edge with the table's scarred boundary. The wax required a pool, a sufficient depth to take the impression without cracking when the metal stamp struck. "Bring it close," Thorne said, "but do not drip upon the text." The usher stepped in, the sulphur scent of the burning linen rising sharp against the resinous smell of the wax stick. Thorne held the red rod over the designated spot, hovering it above the fibre where his signature would soon join the official record. Heat radiated from the flame, warming his skin enough to sting. He tilted the stick. A single drop fell, thick and viscous, landing with a soft tap that sounded like a footstep in an empty room. "Hurry now," the usher muttered, glancing towards the great doors where the last of the nobility were vanishing into the afternoon. "The steward waits." "I am aware." Thorne lowered the wax further. The flame licked the end of the stick, melting the solid red into a liquid that flowed faster, pooling into a circle the size of a shilling. He watched the gloss form, the surface shimmering as it caught the weak light from the high windows. It looked like an eye opening. He blew on the taper to extinguish it, and the usher pulled back, disappearing into the shadows of the pillars without another word. Now came the stamp. Thorne reached for the matrix, the brass seal heavy in his palm. It was cold, far colder than the wax, and the weight of it dragged at his wrist. He positioned it over the molten pool, aligning the crest of the court of the Lord High Steward with the center of the page. His breath caught in his throat. To press was to finalize. Once the metal bit into the cooling resin, the words above it became immutable law, immune to correction or mercy. The delusion about the horses would stand. The madness would be codified. He hesitated. The brass hovered a fraction of an inch above the red pool. Heat rose from the wax, warming his fingers where they gripped the handle. Outside, the clock tower struck the half-hour, the sound muffled by the stone but vibrating through the table legs into his elbows. Time was moving without him. If he delayed too long, the wax would harden and the seal would fail to bite, requiring him to cut it away and start again. To cut the wax would be to damage the parchment. To damage the parchment was to invite scrutiny. He pressed down. The metal sank into the softness with a yielding resistance that traveled up his arm. He held it there, counting the seconds in his head, feeling the heat transfer from the wax to the brass and then into his own skin. It burned slightly, a sharp pinpoint of pain that grounded him in the physical reality of the act. This was not transcription anymore. This was execution. "Is it done?" The voice came from behind him. Thorne did not turn immediately. He kept his hand on the seal, ensuring the edges had set before lifting the weight away. When he finally raised the brass, the red crest remained, sharp and clear, locking the text beneath it in place. The words "the horses are not ready" sat just above the crimson emblem, permanently bound to the authority of the court. "It is done," Thorne said, setting the matrix aside. The usher stepped back into the light, holding a sheet of plain brown paper. He laid it over the fresh seal to protect it from smudging while the wax cooled completely. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his shifting weight. His hands were stained again, not with ink this time, but with the reddish dust from the wax stick. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, trying to remove the color, but it had settled into the lines of his skin. "The steward will send for it," the usher said, folding the protective paper over the document. "You may go." Thorne stood. His legs felt stiff, the blood having settled during the long hours of sitting. He looked around the hall, now largely empty save for a few clerks packing away their own tools and the ushers sweeping the rushes from the floor. The space felt vast without the piers, the high vaults echoing with the scrape of brooms. The dust motes were still there, swirling in the shafts of light, but they seemed less like spirits now and more like debris left after a storm. He picked up his hat. The brim was worn, the felt thinning where his fingers habitually brushed it. He placed it on his head, pulling it low to shield his eyes from the glare of the windows. There was no sense in remaining. The record was sealed. The Earl's fate was no longer a matter of debate, but of administration, a task for the hangman rather than the lawyer. "Mr. Thorne." He turned. The usher held the wrapped transcript in both hands, treating the package with a reverence that suggested it contained something holy rather than legal. "Take care," the usher said, his voice dropping lower. "They say the king reads these himself." "Then let him read," Thorne replied. He walked towards the exit, his boots clicking on the stone flags. The sound was loud in the quiet hall, marking his departure with a rhythm that matched the ticking of the tower clock. He passed the bar where Ferrers had stood, the wood polished smooth by the grip of many hands over the centuries. There was a scratch near the base, deep and jagged, likely made by a ring or a buckle during a previous trial. Thorne ran his finger over it, feeling the groove catch against his skin. Outside, the air was colder, biting at his face as he stepped into Westminster Yard. The sky had turned a bruised purple, clouds gathering over the river. He could hear the distant noise of the city, the cart wheels and the shouting of vendors, sounds of life continuing despite the death warrant locked inside the hall behind him. He buttoned his coat against the wind, tucking his chin into the collar. The wax on his thumb had flaked off, leaving a faint red stain that looked like a healing wound. He rubbed it again, harder this time, but the color remained. It would wash off eventually, with soap and friction, but for now it marked him. He walked towards the gate, merging into the flow of people moving along the pavement, just another clerk finishing a day's work. Behind him, the hall doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing the darkness inside. The yard roared, a cacophony of iron-shod wheels grinding against stone, the crack of whips, and the guttural shouts of coachmen fighting for position drowned out the memory of the hall's solemn quiet. Thorne stepped into the flow of traffic, keeping his head down as a team of greys surged past, their flanks steaming in the cool air. Mud splashed against his stockings, dark spots blooming on the wool, but he did not brush them away. His attention remained fixed on his right hand, specifically the thumb where the wax had bitten into the skin. The redness had deepened, shifting from a surface stain to something embedded within the whorls of his finger marks. It looked less like wax now and more like a bruise that refused to fade. He navigated the press of bodies near the gate, shoulder-checking a peddler carrying a stack of earthenware bowls. The man cursed, shifting his burden to avoid a collision, but Thorne offered no apology. There was no space for courtesy in Westminster Yard when the clock struck 4. Carriages lined the route to the river, their lacquered doors gleaming like beetles in the dim light, waiting to ferry the peers back to their townhouses where dinner would be served on silver plates untouched by the day's violence. Thorne walked in the opposite direction, towards the narrow streets where the clerks drank ale from pewter mugs and loosened their cravats. A boy stepped into his path, holding up a sheet of paper printed with 2E-acute type. "True account of the Earl," the boy chirped, thrusting the broadsheet towards Thorne's chest. "Only a penny, contains the full speech of the Lord High Steward." Thorne stopped. He looked at the paper, then at the boy's grime-streaked face. The ink on the page was still wet, smudging where the boy's thumb had rubbed against the margin. "It is not full," Thorne said. The boy blinked, lowering the paper slightly. "Beg pardon, sir." "The record," Thorne replied, his voice rough from disuse. "You cannot print what was not spoken." "Prints what sells, master." As the boy shuffled closer, sensing a hesitation, he added, "Folks want to know about the madness." Then he pointed out the text. "Says here he spoke of demons." "He spoke of horses." "Horses," the boy laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "That don't sound like much of a demon." It was enough. Thorne pushed past him, the paper brushing against his coat sleeve. "Keep your penny." He walked faster, leaving the boy calling after him about other trials, other deaths, other commodities to be bought and sold before the sun went down. The lie propagated itself instantly, spreading through the city like smoke from a chimney. By evening, every coffee house in London would know that Ferrers was mad with demons, not delusions of transport. The truth sat sealed inside the hall, bound in wax and locked away from the public eye. Thorne flexed his thumb, feeling the skin tighten over the hardened wax. It pulled at the nail bed, a constant physical reminder that he had pressed the seal himself. He had authorized the discrepancy. The street narrowed as he moved towards the Thames, the buildings leaning inward until they nearly touched overhead. Here the smell changed from horse dung to coal smoke and rotting fish. A woman stood in a doorway, scrubbing a linen sheet with a wooden dolly. She paused as he passed, watching him with the dull curiosity of someone who sees many clerks but few who look so haunted. Thorne avoided her gaze, focusing on the cobbles beneath his boots. They were uneven, slick with refuse, requiring constant attention to avoid a twisted ankle. This demanded focus. It kept his mind from drifting back to the red pool of wax and the heat rising from it. He reached the tavern known as the Mitre, pushing open the door to escape the wind. The interior was warm, thick with the scent of roasted meat and tobacco smoke. Clerks sat at long tables, their quills tucked behind ears, discussing the day's proceedings with the detached interest of men watching a play from the gallery. Thorne found a spot in the corner, ordering ale from a serving girl who did not ask why he was alone. She set the mug down, the foam spilling over the rim onto the scarred wood. "Busy day," she said, wiping the spill with a rag. "The busiest," Thorne replied. "They say he'll hang." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Peers usually get the axe." "Not this one." Thorne lifted the mug, the pewter cold against his palm. "He murdered a steward. They wish to make an example." "Seems harsh." "Justice is not gentle." He took a drink, the ale bitter and flat. "It is merely final." The girl moved away to attend to a group of louder men near the fire, leaving Thorne with his thoughts and the stain on his thumb. He rested his hand on the table, palm up, examining the damage under the light of the tallow candles. The wax had flaked at the edges, revealing raw skin beneath that wept a clear fluid. It was a small wound, insignificant in the scale of the city's suffering, yet it throbbed with a rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock he had left behind in the hall. He picked at the edge of the scab with his fingernail, tempting the blood to surface. A man sat down opposite him, removing a tricorn hat to reveal thinning grey hair. It was Mr. Gurney, a senior clerk from the King's Bench Division. "Thorne," Gurney said, nodding, "I heard you handled the ceiling." "I did. Clean work." "Clean enough." Gurney signaled for a drink, his eyes lingering on Thorne's hand. "Do not pick at it, it will scar." "Let it." "Vanities," Gurney murmured, accepting his tankard. "You think this matters, the wax, the paper, the ink." "It matters to the record." "The record is what they say it is." Gurney took a long pull of ale, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before declaring that Ferrers hangs on the 5th of May. "That is the truth that matters. The rest is decoration for the lawyers." Thorne looked down at his thumb. The blood had not come, only the clear fluid that stained the skin shiny. He wiped it on his breeches, leaving a dark spot on the fabric. "Decoration," Thorne repeated. "Drink up." Gurney stood, placing coins on the table. "Tomorrow we begin the paperwork for the execution warrant. You will be needed for the transcription." Thorne did not move. The noise of the tavern seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the distant tolling of a bell from across the river. The execution warrant, another layer of ink to cover the man, another seal to press into wax until the human being beneath was entirely obscured by procedure. "Will you be there?" Thorne asked. Gurney paused, his hand on the back of his chair. "Someone must ensure the syntax is correct. The hangman does not care for grammar. He cares for the rope." "Same thing in the end." Gurney tilted his head. "Both bind the neck." He walked away, merging into the crowd near the bar. Thorne sat alone, the ale untouched before him. He looked at his thumb again. The red stain had spread slightly, creeping towards the knuckle like a slow infection. He could wash it. He could scrub it with lye and sand until the skin roared and bled, but the memory of the heat would remain. The weight of the brass matrix would stay in his muscle memory. He closed his hand into a fist, hiding the mark from view. Outside, the bell tolled again, counting the hour, 5 o'clock. The light was fading fast, the shadows lengthening across the table to swallow the mug and his hidden hand. He stood up, leaving the ale for the girl to clear. There was no point in staying. The paperwork would wait until morning, but the weight of it would not. He pushed through the door and back into the street, where the darkness had fully claimed the yard. The air was colder now, biting through his coat. He turned towards home, walking steadily against the flow of the crowd, carrying the stain in his pocket like a stolen coin. The air inside Westminster Hall hung heavy and cold, smelling of wet stone and the lingering smoke of yesterday's candles. Elias Thorne stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking softly against the flagstones before the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the space. He carried the leather satchel close to his ribs, feeling the hard outline of the metal vessel within pressing against his coat. It was too early for the peers, too early for the crowds that would soon pack the galleries like fruit in a crate, yet the hall felt occupied by something less tangible. He reached the clerk's table, a scarred expanse of oak that had borne witness to centuries of judgments, and set the weighted pot down. The metal clinked, a sharp note that echoed up towards the hammer-beam roof. Thorne unpacked his quills, laying them out in a row according to the stiffness of their nibs, arranging them like surgical instruments before an operation. His thumb throbbed where the wax had bitten into the skin the night before, a dull ache that pulsed in time with the distant ticking of the tower clock. "Early again, Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the shadows near the pillars. An usher stepped forward, holding a lantern that cast long, dancing shapes against the wall. Thorne did not startle. He had heard the man's approach in the shift of air pressure. "The record waits for no man," Thorne said, dipping a test quill into the well. The ink rose black and viscous, clinging to the nib like blood from a deep cut. "Nor does the hangman," the usher replied, setting the lantern on the far corner of the table. "Lord Ferrers is already in the tower," heard him pacing. Thorne blotting the excess ink on a scrap of parchment, watching the dark stains spread into the fibers. "Pacing does not signify guilt." "Nothing signifies guilt like a rope," the usher said, turning away. "Keep your sand close. It will be a long day." The man vanished back into the gloom, leaving Thorne alone with the lightning grey of the morning filtering through the high windows. Shafts of pale illumination pierced the gloom, illuminating the dust that swirled in the stillness. These motes danced in the light, swirling around the empty space behind the bar where the accused would stand, resembling unsettled spirits awaiting their cue. Thorne watched them gather, noting how they seemed to avoid the center of the room, as if repelled by a heat they could not feel. He smoothed a fresh sheet of parchment before him, weighting the corners with small lead blocks to prevent the curl of humidity. The surface was smooth and cream-colored, waiting to be stained. He picked up the primary quill, testing the point against the paper to ensure it would not snag. A blot here would be an error, a blot there would be a sin. The law demanded perfection even when the men administering it were flawed. The heavy doors groaned open. The Lord High Steward entered with the procession of peers, their ermine robes whispering against the stone floor as they took their places upon the woolpacks. Thorne lowered his eyes to avoid the gaze of the nobility, focusing instead on the ritualistic unpacking of the indictment scrolls which smelled of vinegar and old anxiety. The rustle of silk and the heavy tread of boots filled the space, pushing the dust motes into new patterns of agitation. He dipped his quill into the cold metal anchor, the ink rising dark and viscous, resembling blood drawn from a vein rather than fluid meant for writing. "Begin the header," the clerk of the crown murmured, not looking up from his own stack of papers. Thorne wrote the date, 16 April 1760. The nib scratched against the surface, a dry sound that seemed too loud in the growing quiet. He wrote the title of the court, the names of the peers, each letter formed with precise, mechanical movements that belied the tremor in his wrist. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a trail of permanent black that could not be undone once dry. Laurence Shirley, the Earl Ferrers, was brought to the bar, dressed in morning black that seemed to absorb the weak light of the hall rather than reflect it. He did not look at the crowd, but fixed his eyes upon the Lord High Steward, maintaining a rigid posture that suggests control despite the shackles hidden beneath his cuffs. Thorne watched the Earl's hands, noting how they remained perfectly still while the rest of the room shifted in anticipatory discomfort. There was a pallor to the man's skin, a waxy quality that made him look like an effigy dressed in clothes too large for his frame. The indictment was read aloud by the clerk of the crown, the words rolling through the hall with a rhythmic cadence that turned the accusation of murder into a liturgical chant. Thorne transcribed the title and the charge, his hand moving automatically while his mind recoiled at the finality of the words willful murder staining the fresh page. The ticking of the tower clock outside penetrated the silence, marking the seconds that stripped the Earl of his time, just as the indictment strips him of his presumption of innocence. Each tick was a hammer blow, counting down to a conclusion that had already been decided in the hearts of men who valued order over truth. Thorne paused, the quill hovering above the paper. A single drop of ink gathered at the nib, swelling until gravity pulled it down to spot the parchment. He cursed it under his breath, reaching for the sand shaker to blot the error before it could spread. The grey powder absorbed the liquid, leaving a rough patch on the otherwise smooth surface. It was a small blemish, invisible to anyone not looking for it, yet it felt like a wound on the body of the record. "Continue," the Clerk of the Crown said, his voice flat. Thorne shook the sand loose and resumed writing. The scratch of the nib resumed, keeping time with the clock. He could feel the eyes of the peers on the back of his neck, a physical weight that pressed him down into the chair. They were watching the Earl, but they were also watching the scribe who captured their proceedings, knowing that his ink would outlast their ermine. The Earl shifted his weight, the chain beneath his coat clinking softly. It was a faint sound, barely audible over the voice of the clerk, yet it cut through the room like a knife. Ferrers did not look at Thorne, but the clerk felt the movement in his own muscles, a sympathetic tension that tightened his shoulder. The dust motes settled around the Earl's shoulders, gathering like grey fur on the black cloth of his coat. Thorne dipped the quill again. The ink was cooling in the well, becoming thicker, harder to draw. He stirred it with the nib, watching the ripples spread to the edges of the metal. It was a cold, unyielding anchor, its smooth weight contrasting with the trembling hands of the scribe, symbolizing the rigid, unfeeling nature of the law that holds fast while human composure shatters. He lifted the quill, ready to record the plea, but the word caught in his throat. Guilty or not guilty? The choice hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls. Thorne looked at the Earl, really looked at him, and saw not a peer but a man standing on the edge of a precipice. The dust swirled between them, obscuring the view for a fraction of a second. When it cleared, Ferrers was speaking, his voice rough from disuse. "I am ready," the Earl said. Thorne pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed. The record began. The words "not guilty" required more ink than the date. Thorne pressed harder to form the capital letters, forcing the nib to bite into the fiber until the parchment groaned under the strain. Black lines swelled where the pressure lingered, ugly thickets of script that looked less like law and more like a bruise spreading beneath skin. He lifted the quill and waited for the ink to set, watching the sheen fade from wet gloss to matte finality. "Laurence Shirley, Earl Ferrers," the Clerk of the Crown intoned, his voice carrying the dry rasp of a man who had shouted orders across too many decked courts. "How wilt thou be tried?" Ferrers shifted. The iron beneath his waistcoat clicked against a button, a sharp metallic note that startled a pigeon roosting in the rafters above. Wings beat against the timber, scattering shadows across the woolpacks where the peers sat in rigid judgment. Thorne did not look up at the bird. He kept his eyes on the Earl's mouth, waiting for the shape of the words that would seal the proceedings. "By God and my peers," Ferrers said. The response was quiet, lacking the boom one might expect from a man accused of shooting his steward in a fit of drunken rage. Thorne scratched the answer onto the page, the speed of his hands struggling to match the sudden acceleration of the court. Sand hissed over the fresh line, gritting between the fingers as he brushed the excess away. It stuck to the damp ink, creating a rough texture that would catch the quill on any future review. A permanent record, unchangeable. "Guilty of what?" the Lord High Steward asked, leaning forward until the ermine on his shoulders slumped like heavy snow. "Of the murder of John Johnson." The name hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls. Thorne wrote it down, but his hand hesitated over the surname. Johnson, a common name for a common man, yet here it stood equal to the Earl in the geometry of the line. He dipped the nib into the silver well, seeking the cool fluid to lubricate the friction building in his wrist. The metal rim clinked against the tooth of the quill, a small sound lost in the shuffle of papers as the prosecution began to arrange their exhibits. "Proceed," the steward commanded. A barrister stood, adjusting the wig that sat too high on his powdered hair. He held a sheet of paper that trembled slightly in the draft sweeping through the hall. Thorne knew that draft. It came from the river, carrying the smell of low tide and rotting wood that no amount of lavender water could mask from the nobility's handkerchiefs. He breathed it in, letting the stench ground him, while the barrister began to speak of malice and forethought. "The prisoner did furnish himself with a pistol," the barrister said, pacing the space before the bar. "He did load it with ball and powder. He did seek out the deceased." Thorne's wrist cramped. The muscle jumped beneath the linen cuff, a spasm that threatened to drag the quill across the page in a jagged scar. He forced the hand flat, pressing the palm against the cool oak until the tremor subsided. Pain shot up the forearm, sharp and bright, but he did not stop writing. To stop was to lose the thread, and to lose the thread was to fail the court. The ink flowed again, dark and viscous, resembling blood drawn from a vein rather than fluid meant for writing. Ferrers watched the barrister. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until the iris was nearly swallowed by black. He was not listening to the words. Thorne saw it in the way the Earl's head tilted, as if catching a sound from a different room, a different time. The madness was not a roar, it was a silence inside the man that the noise of the court could not penetrate. "Object," Ferrers whispered. The word was so soft Thorne almost missed it. He paused, the quill hovering above the paper. The barrister continued, speaking now of the wound and the distance between the men. Thorne looked at the Earl. Ferrers was staring at the empty space beside the Clerk of the Crown, his lips moving in a silent count. 1, 2, 3. "Did you hear that?" Thorne muttered to the clerk beside him. "Hear what?" He spoke. "Record the testimony, Thorne. Do not record the ghosts." Thorne swallowed the objection. The law demanded only what was spoken aloud, not what was seen in the corners of the room. He pressed the nib down, capturing the barrister's description of the pistol barrel. Iron, cold, greased. The words stacked up, building a wall between the man and the crime. Ferrers stopped counting. He turned his head slowly, scanning the piers until his gaze landed on Thorne. For a second the connection held. Thorne felt the weight of it, a physical pressure behind the eyes that made them water. The Earl's look was not one of anger, but of recognition. He knew the clerk was writing him down. He knew the ink would outlast the flesh. Ferrers opened his mouth again, wider this time, ready to shout, but the steward's gavel struck the desk. "Order!" The sound cracked like a whip. Ferrers flinched, the chains beneath his coat rattling in response. He looked away, focusing on his own hands, which were now trembling so violently they blurred in Thorne's vision. The dust in the air seemed to thicken, clustering around the Earl's head like a halo of grey ash. Thorne wanted to look away, to focus on the grain of the table or the pattern of the light, but the duty held him fast. He had to capture the shake. He had to capture the fear. "The prisoner was heard to say," the barrister continued, ignoring the interruption, "that he would be hanged for it." Thorne wrote the words, "would be hanged," a prophecy spoken by the accused before the verdict was even passed. The irony tasted like copper in the back of his throat. He dipped the quill again, but the well was nearly dry. He scraped the bottom, gathering the last dregs of the black fluid. It came up thick, clogging the slit of the nib. He wiped it on the rag, leaving a dark smear on the linen that looked like a wound. "Is this true?" the steward asked, addressing Ferrers directly. The Earl did not answer immediately. He was breathing heavily, the chest rising and falling beneath the morning black. Sweat had broken out on his upper lip, gathering in beads that caught the light. He looked at the steward, then at the piers, and finally at the window where the pale sun struggled against the cloud cover. "It is true," Ferrers said, his voice cracking on the second word. "But the horses." "The horses," the steward leaned forward, the ermine shifting with a sound like dry leaves. "There were no horses," Ferrers whispered, so low the words barely reached the bar. "They told me there were horses." Thorne stopped writing. The quill hovered, a drop of ink swelling at the tip, ready to fall. This was the delusion, the thing that made him mad, the thing that made him dangerous. If he wrote it, it became part of the record. If he wrote it, the physicians would read it and nod. If he did not, it never happened. The drop grew heavier, trembling on the steel point. "Record it," the Clerk of the Crown hissed, nudging Thorne's elbow. Thorne lowered the quill. The ink touched the paper and spread, a small black star expanding on the page. He wrote the words about the horses, knowing they would be dissected later by men who had never seen a madman speak to empty air. The scratching resumed, louder now, aggressive. Ferrers closed his eyes, swaying slightly on his feet, as if the floor beneath him had turned to water. The barrister shuffled his papers, preparing the next witness. A man in a plain coat stood up from the back of the hall, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Ferrers with a mixture of pity and disgust. Thorne recognized the look. It was the look men gave to broken tools. He dipped the quill into the fresh pot of ink, the silver rim cold against his knuckle. The clock outside struck the hour, the sound muffled by the stone, but the vibration traveled through the table and into Thorne's arms. Time was moving, the trial was moving, the end was coming closer with every scratch of the nib. Thorne looked at the fresh page, filled with the evidence of a life undone. He looked at Ferrers, who was now staring at the witness with an intensity that bordered on violence. The drop of ink on the previous line had dried, leaving a rough spot that would catch the light. "John Johnson's brother," the clerk announced. Thorne poised the quill. The name Johnson appeared again, a second stain on the page. Ferrers straightened, the sway in his posture vanishing as if he had been pulled upright by a string. His eyes locked on the witness. The air in the hall grew thin, hard to draw into the lungs. Thorne waited for the first question, but the silence stretched, taut and brittle. Ferrers opened his mouth, not to speak to the court, but to speak to the brother. "You knew," Ferrers said. The witness flinched. Thorne's hand tightened on the quill until the wood dug into his palm. The record waited. The ink waited. The truth hung between them, unstable and dangerous. The brother flinched. It was a small movement, barely a twitch of the shoulder, yet it traveled through the quiet hall like a shockwave. He did not deny it, nor did he confirm the accusation hanging between them, visible as smoke. Instead, he turned his face towards the Lord High Steward, seeking protection from the bench rather than the truth. "I knew him," the witness said. His voice lacked the resonance of the barrister's, possessing instead the flat timbre of a man accustomed to speaking only when spoken to. Thorne observed the man's hands. They were rough, the knuckles swollen from labor or perhaps the cold walk to Westminster, and they twisted the hem of his plain coat until the fabric whitened. This was not a gentleman giving evidence. This was grief dressed in wool. "Confine your answers to the matters of the 16th day of January," the steward commanded, his gavel resting near his hand like a sleeping weapon. "The matters of the day," the brother repeated. He looked at Ferrers again, but only for a heartbeat. The Earl stood rigid at the bar, the chains beneath his morning coat silent now, weighed down by the sheer force of his stillness. Thorne dragged the quill across the parchment, the scratch sounding loud enough to draw blood. He needed to capture the tone, not just the words. The law demanded precision, yet precision felt like a lie when applied to such raw hurt. "Did the prisoner speak to you regarding the steward?" the barrister asked. "He did." "In what manner?" Angry, the word dropped onto the floor, heavy and final, for he said Johnson had cheated him and declared that Johnson would be answerable for every farthing. Thorne wrote answerable for every farthing. The ink pooled in the loops of the letters, dark and wet. It looked less like writing and more like a wound opening on the page. His wrist ached, a dull throb radiating from the bone where it rested against the hard oak. He wanted to shake the feeling out, to loosen the grip on the wood, but the clerk of the Crown sat close enough to notice any lapse in diligence. To stop was to admit weakness. To admit weakness was to invite scrutiny. "Did he threaten violence?" The brother hesitated. His eyes flicked to the peers, those rows of ermine-clad figures watching with the detached curiosity of men viewing a play. They were safe in their high seats, insulated from the violence described below. "He held the pistol," the brother said. A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly suppressed by a glare from the ushers. Thorne did not look up. He focused on the nib, on the way the slit widened as pressure increased. If he pressed too hard, the metal would splay. The line would thicken. The record would show emphasis where none was intended. "Describe the weapon," the barrister said. "A horse pistol, heavy. He kept it in his coat." "Did he load it in your presence?" "No." "Then how do you know it was loaded?" The brother swallowed. The sound was audible in the stillness, a dry click in a throat tightened by fear. "He told me, said it was for Johnson, said no man could betray him alive." Ferrers shifted. The leather of his shoes creaked against the stone floor. He opened his mouth, perhaps to correct the testimony, perhaps to offer some justification rooted in the logic of a mind unmoored from reason. The steward raised a hand. "Prisoner, you will have opportunity to speak in your defense," the Lord High Steward said. "Until then, you will remain silent." The command hung there, heavy and absolute. Ferrers closed his mouth. The muscles in his jaw worked, grinding together under the skin. He looked at his brother-in-law, the witness, with an expression that Thorne could not transcribe. It was not anger, it was betrayal. A profound, isolating shock that stripped the nobility from his face and left only a man accused by his own kin. Thorne dipped the pen, the silver well caught a shaft of light, flashing briefly before the ink swallowed the reflection. He wrote betrayal in his mind, but on the page he wrote silent. The discrepancy sat between them, unrecorded yet undeniable. He was not merely a scribe, he was a filter. He chose what passed through the nib and what remained trapped in the throat of the court. Did the steward appear fearful? The barrister continued, pressing towards the motive. Johnson, the brother, shook his head, saying Johnson had refused to be bullied because he possessed the accounts to prove his honesty. And the prisoner's reaction? He struck him. The hall drew breath as Thorne's hand paused, the ink gathering at the tip in a black bead threatening to fall. He waited for it to swell, to drop, to ruin the line, yet it held. Moving the quill forward, he formed the letters of struck, reducing violence to a verb. It was a past tense action sealed in black fluid. Where did he strike him? On the head, with the butt of the pistol. Ferrers made a sound. It was low, animalistic, a noise of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. He gripped the bar before him, the wood groaning under the pressure of his fingers. Thorne saw the knuckles whiten, matching the white of the witness's twisted coat hem. Two men holding on to something solid while the ground gave way. Order, the steward warned. I did not mean to kill him, Ferrers said. The words slipped out before the guards could intervene. They were not shouted. They were whispered, yet they carried further than any shout could have. The brother looked down at his shoes. The barrister shuffled his papers, pretending to search for a document that did not need finding. Record the outburst, the clerk of the Crown muttered. Thorne wrote it, I did not mean to kill him. The confession sat on the page, stark and undeniable. It contradicted the charge of malice. It suggested accident. It suggested madness. Yet Thorne knew how this would be read. Men who killed their stewards did not accidentally shoot them at close range. The law would not care for the nuance of a trembling hand or a mind lost to delusion. The law required a body and a cause. Step down, the steward said to the witness. The brother moved quickly. He did not look at Ferrers as he passed the bar. He hurried towards the door, his steps echoing on the stone, eager to escape the room where his testimony had sealed a fate. Thorne watched him go. The man's shoulders were hunched, as if expecting a blow from behind. When the door closed, the sound was final, a latch clicking shut on a coffin. Ferrers stood alone again, the space where the brother had stood seeming emptier than before, a void filled only by the lingering scent of wool and sweat. He looked at Thorne, not through him, but at him. The recognition was there again, sharp and uncomfortable, for he knew the clerk was writing his downfall. He knew the ink would dry and harden, becoming more permanent than flesh. Thorne looked down at the page. The words stared back, arranged in neat lines that suggested order. They suggested that justice was being done. They did not show the tremor in the Earl's hand. They did not show the shame in the brother's eyes. They did not show the way the light failed in the hall as the afternoon wore on, leaving the peers in shadow. He reached for the sand shaker to dry the fresh line. The sand poured out, grey and coarse, covering the wet ink. He blew away the excess. The grains scattered across the table, settling into the grain of the wood. Some stuck to his fingers, gritty and persistent. He brushed them off, but they clung to the creases of his skin. Next witness, the clerk announced. The voice sounded distant. Thorne flexed his hand. The cramp had spread to his forearm, a tight band of pain that refused to loosen. He dipped the quill once more. The ink was lower now, the silver bottom visible through the dark fluid. He would need to refill soon. He would need to continue. The trial moved forward, relentless and indifferent to the ache in his wrist or the hollow look in the prisoner's eyes. Ferrers closed his eyes. He stood very still, conserving energy for whatever came next. The shadows lengthened across the floor, creeping towards the bar like tide water. Thorne prepared the line for the next name. The page was half full. There was much more to record before the gavel fell, much more ink to spill. The clock outside struck the hour, a dull iron boom that vibrated through the stone floor and up into the soles of Thorne's shoes. 4. The afternoon was dying. He lifted the silver inkwell, feeling the slight shift of fluid inside, a lazy slosh that warned of emptiness. Cork popped as he uncorked the reserve bottle, releasing the sharp, acidic tang of gall nuts and iron that always smelled to him like old wounds healing poorly. "More ink, Mr. Thorne." The clerk of the Crown did not turn his head. The question was tossed over a shoulder, casual, as if asking for a pinch of salt rather than the substance required to condemn a peer to death. "I have it." Thorne poured. The black stream thickened as it entered the well, rising slowly to cover the bottom of the silver cup. He watched the level climb, mesmerized by the way the surface tension held the liquid just below the rim, a dark mirror waiting to be broken. A drop spilled over the edge, landing on the oak table with a soft tap. He dabbed it with a rag before it could run onto his breeches. Stains on the record were forgiven, stains on the clerk were not. Ferrers shifted at the bar. The movement was slight, a redistribution of weight from one foot to the other, yet it drew the eyes of every peer in the hall. Their ermine robes rustled, a dry sound like leaves skittering across a grave, as they adjusted their posture to watch the prisoner. Thorne dipped the quill, wiping the excess against the rim until the nib held precisely enough to write, but not enough to blot. He tested the flow on the margin, a single curved line that looked like a scar. "Bring in Mr. Stevens," the Lord High Steward commanded. The voice carried without effort, buoyed by the architecture of the hall, which seemed designed to amplify judgment. Doors opened at the far end. A man entered, dressed in the plain wool of a servant, his hands clasped tightly before him to hide any tremor. He walked with his head down, eyes fixed on the path between the benches, avoiding the gaze of the nobility as if looking up might invite a curse. Thorne recognized the gait. It was the walk of a man who knew he was about to speak words that would haunt him in the quiet of his own bedroom later. The servant stopped before the bar, turning to face the steward, but keeping his body angled away from Ferrers. Thorne prepared the line, scratching the date and the name into the top of the fresh section. Mr. Stevens. The letters formed quickly, muscle memory taking over, while his mind drifted to the cramp tightening in his forearm. It felt like a wire wrapped around the bone, twisting deeper with every movement of his wrist. He shook the hand loosely, trying to dislodge the tension, but the pain remained, a dull anchor dragging behind the nib. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" "I do." The servant's voice was thin, reedy, lacking the resonance required to fill the space. He swallowed hard, the bob of his throat visible even from Thorne's distance. Ferrers lifted his head. For the first time in an hour, his eyes were fully open, focused on the man standing before him. There was no anger in the look, only a weary recognition, as if he knew the servant from a dream he could not quite recall. "State your relation to the prisoner," the clerk of the Crown said. "I am the valet, my lord." "And were you present on the day of the incident?" "I was." Thorne wrote the words down as they were spoken, the scratch of the nib keeping time with the clock outside. "I was," 2 words, simple, devastating. He paused, holding the quill above the paper while the servant continued. The ink gathered at the tip, a black bead threatening to fall. He waited for it to swell, to drop, to ruin the line. It held. He moved the quill forward, forming the letters of present. Presence reduced to a noun, a state of being sealed in black fluid. "He asked for the pistol," Stevens said. The room tightened. Thorne felt the shift in the air, a sudden pressure against his eardrums as the peers leaned forward in unison. Ferrers did not move. He stood perfectly still, conserving energy, his face a mask of pale stone that betrayed nothing of the storm inside. Thorne pressed the nib harder than necessary, the metal tines spreading slightly to release a thicker line. He wanted the words to look heavy on the page. He wanted the record to bear the weight of the moment. "Which pistol?" "The one he kept in the drawer, the small pair." Stevens glanced at Ferrers then, a fleeting look that lasted no more than a second. It was enough. The Earl's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin near the ear. He knew what was coming. He knew the servant was about to describe the preparation of the weapon, the loading of the ball, the priming of the pan. Each detail was a nail being driven into the coffin of his defense. Thorne watched the hand of the prisoner curl inward, fingernails digging into the palm until the skin turned white. "Record it all," the clerk muttered. Thorne did not need the instruction. He was already writing, the words tumbling out faster than the servant could speak. He loaded it himself. The phrase looked innocent on the page, neat and orderly, but it carried the scent of powder and death. He paused to dip the quill again, the silver well now half full, reflecting the dim light from the windows in a distorted smear. His reflection stared back, warped and dark, a stranger with ink-stained fingers and eyes that refused to meet the glass. "Did he speak to you?" the steward asked. "He said the horses were ready." A murmur ran through the hall. Horses. Again, the delusion surfaced like a corpse floating to the top of a pond, undeniable and grotesque. Thorne wrote the word down, feeling the absurdity of it clash with the solemnity of the court. Horses. There were no horses. There was only the coach outside, and the steward dead on the floor, and the pistol lying on the table. Yet here it was, entered into the permanent record, a lie that would stand as truth once the ink dried. Ferrers closed his eyes. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the bar before anyone could step forward to assist. The shame of it was visible in the way he straightened his coat, pulling the fabric tight over his chest, as if trying to hold himself together by force of will. Thorne stopped writing. He held the quill suspended, waiting for the Earl to regain his composure. The clock outside ticked again, slower this time, or perhaps his own heart had quickened to match the rhythm of the proceedings. "Continue," the steward said. "He told me to saddle them," Stevens whispered. "But there were no horses." "No, my lord." Thorne looked down at the page. The words stared back, arranged in neat lines that suggested order. They suggested that justice was being done. They did not show the tremor in the Earl's hand. They did not show the fear in the servant's eyes. They did not show the way the light failed in the hall as the afternoon wore on, leaving the peers in shadow. He reached for the sand shaker to dry the fresh line, but his hand hovered over the pot. The sand seemed suddenly coarse, abrasive, like ground bone meant to scrub away the evidence. "Mr. Thorne." The clerk's voice cut through his hesitation, sharp, impatient. "Yes, right." Thorne dipped the quill. The ink was lower now, the silver bottom visible through the dark fluid. He would need to refill soon. He would need to continue. The trial moved forward, relentless and indifferent to the ache in his wrist or the hollow look in the prisoner's eyes. Ferrers opened his eyes and looked at the clerk, not through him, but at him. The recognition was there again, sharp and uncomfortable. He knew the clerk was writing his downfall. He knew the ink would dry and harden, becoming more permanent than flesh. "Did he threaten you?" the steward asked. Stevens hesitated. He looked at Ferrers, then at the peers, then at the floor. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap under the weight of the unspoken answer. Thorne waited. The quill hovered above the paper, a loaded weapon poised to strike. "He said," Stevens began, his voice cracking on the first syllable, "he said Johnson was stealing the oats." Ferrers made a sound. It was low, animalistic, a noise of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. He gripped the bar before him, the wood groaning under the pressure of his fingers. Thorne saw the knuckles whiten, matching the white of the witness's twisted coat hem, two men holding on to something solid while the ground gave way. The quill touched the paper. The ink flowed. There was no going back. The word oats sat upon the parchment, absurd and heavy. Thorne dragged the nib across the fiber, feeling the resistance of the paper as the rough surface caught the metal and threatened to snatch the line before it could even begin to shape the letter. It was a common noun, fit for a ledger or a stable boys' list, yet here it served as proof of a mind unspooling in public. He lifted the quill and wiped the excess fluid on the rim of the silver well, watching the dark drop fall back into the pool with a ripple that disturbed his own reflection. "Specify the conversation," the Lord High Steward commanded. Stevens shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the leather of his boots creaking in the quiet hall. He smelled of the stable, a pungent mix of hay and horse sweat that cut through the scent of beeswax and old stones surrounding the piers. It was an intrusion, a reminder of the dirty work that kept the estate running while the masters debated law in their ermine robes. "He asked for the accounts," Stevens said. "I told him Mr. Johnson had them." "And the response?" "He said Johnson was a thief stealing feed for beasts that did not exist." A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and indistinct, like wind moving through dry grass. Thorne wrote it down, the scratching of his nib loud in the sudden stillness. He felt the eyes of the peers on the back of his neck, a physical weight pressing between his shoulder blades. They were watching him write, judging the speed of his hand, as if the urgency of his transcription might validate the truth of the words. He kept his movements steady, refusing to let the tremor in his wrist show on the page. Ferrers stepped forward. The wood of the bar groaned under his grip. "It is a lie," the Earl said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp edge of a blade drawn in a quiet room. The peers turned to look at him, their faces impassive masks of powdered wig and judgment. Thorne stopped writing. He held the quill suspended above the paper, the ink gathering at the tip in a trembling sphere that threatened to drop and ruin the line below. "You are not to address the court unless called upon," the steward said. "I am addressing the truth. You are addressing the air." Thorne recorded the exchange, the dialogue forming a jagged pattern on the sheet. It looked like an argument between equals, but it was not. One man held the power of life and death, and the other held only a delusion about horses that had never been foaled. He dipped the quill again, the silver bottom of the well catching the light from the high windows. The glare struck his eye, brief and blinding, forcing him to blink away the spot that danced in his vision. "Continue, witness," the steward ordered. Stevens swallowed. His Adam's apple moved like a stone trapped beneath the skin of his throat. He looked at Ferrers with a pity that was barely concealed, a dangerous emotion to show a man on trial for his life. "He drew the pistol," Stevens whispered. The hall tightened. Thorne felt the shift in the air, a sudden pressure against his eardrums as the nobility leaned forward in unison. Ferrers did not move. He stood perfectly still, conserving energy, his face a mask of pale stone that betrayed nothing of the storm inside. Thorne pressed the nib harder than necessary, the metal tines spreading slightly to release a thicker line. He wanted the words to look heavy on the page. He wanted the record to bear the weight of the moment. "Which pistol?" "The one he kept in the drawer, the small pair." Stevens glanced at Ferrers then, a fleeting look that lasted no more than a second. It was enough. The Earl's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin near the ear. He knew what was coming. He knew the servant was about to describe the preparation of the weapon, the loading of the ball, the priming of the pan. Each detail was a nail being driven into the coffin of his defense. Thorne watched the hand of the prisoner curl inward, fingernails digging into the palm until the skin turned white. "Record it all," the clerk muttered. Thorne did not need the instruction. He was already writing, the words tumbling out faster than the servant could speak. He loaded it himself. The phrase looked innocent on the page, neat and orderly, but it carried the scent of powder and death. He paused to dip the quill again, the silver well now half full, reflecting the dim light from the windows in a distorted smear. His reflection stared back, warped and dark, a stranger with ink-stained fingers and eyes that refused to meet the glass. "Did he speak to you?" the steward asked. "He said the horses were ready." A murmur ran through the hall. Horses. Again, the delusion surfaced like a corpse floating to the top of a pond, undeniable and grotesque. Thorne wrote the word down, feeling the absurdity of it clash with the solemnity of the court. Horses. There were no horses. There was only the coach outside, and the steward dead on the floor, and the pistol lying on the table. Yet here it was, entered into the permanent record, a lie that would stand as truth once the ink dried. Ferrers closed his eyes. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the bar before anyone could step forward to assist. The shame of it was visible in the way he straightened his coat, pulling the fabric tight over his chest, as if trying to hold himself together by force of will. Thorne stopped writing. He held the quill suspended, waiting for the Earl to regain his composure. The clock outside ticked again, slower this time, or perhaps his own heart had quickened to match the rhythm of the proceedings. "Continue," the steward said. "He told me to saddle them," Stevens whispered. "But there were no horses." "No, my lord." Thorne looked down at the page. The words stared back, arranged in neat lines that suggested order. They suggested that justice was being done. They did not show the tremor in the Earl's hand. They did not show the fear in the witness's eyes. They did not show the way the light failed in the hall as the afternoon wore on, leaving the peers in shadow. He reached for the sand shaker to dry the fresh line, but his hand hovered over the pot. The sand seemed suddenly coarse, abrasive, like ground bone meant to scrub away the evidence. "Mr. Thorne." The clerk's voice cut through his hesitation, sharp, impatient. "Yes, right." Thorne dipped the quill. The ink was lower now, the silver bottom visible through the dark fluid. He would need to refill soon. He would need to continue. The trial moved forward, relentless and indifferent to the ache in his wrist or the hollow look in the prisoner's eyes. Ferrers opened his eyes and looked at the clerk, not through him but at him. The recognition was there again, sharp and uncomfortable. He knew the clerk was writing his downfall. He knew the ink would dry and harden, becoming more permanent than flesh. "Did he threaten you?" the steward asked. Stevens hesitated. He looked at Ferrers, then at the peers, then at the floor. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap under the weight of the unspoken answer. Thorne waited. The quill hovered above the paper, a loaded weapon poised to strike. "He said," Stevens began, his voice cracking on the first syllable, "he said Johnson was stealing the oats." Ferrers made a sound. It was low, animalistic, a noise of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. He gripped the bar before him, the wood groaning under the pressure of his fingers. Thorne saw the knuckles whiten, matching the white of the witness's twisted coat hem, two men holding on to something solid while the ground gave way. The quill touched the paper. The ink flowed. There was no going back. Thorne finished the line and reached for the sand shaker, shaking the coarse grey dust over the wet script until the words were buried beneath a layer of grit. He tapped the parchment to remove the excess, watching the grains fall onto the table like tiny stones from a quarry. The ink beneath was hidden now, sealed away from the air, but he knew it was still wet, still vulnerable to the smear of a careless sleeve. "State the location," the steward said. "In the counting house," Stevens replied. "And the victim?" "Mr. Johnson stood by the ledger." Ferrers lifted his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were raising a heavy weight from the floor. He looked at Stevens, and for a moment the madness receded, leaving only a cold, clear hatred that chilled the air between them. It was not the look of a madman, but of a master correcting a servant who had stepped out of line. Thorne felt a coldness settle in his own stomach, a heavy stone dropping into the pit of his gut. "He betrayed the trust," Ferrers said. His voice was calm now, stripped of the earlier volatility. It was the voice of a man who believed he was right, utterly and completely, regardless of the law or the facts or the dead man on the floor. Thorne wrote the words down, feeling the lie take shape beneath his hand. He was not recording truth. He was recording belief. He was preserving the delusion for posterity, ensuring that future generations would read the Earl's madness as if it were fact. "Objection," the clerk said. "Overruled," the steward replied. "Let the record show the statement." Thorne wrote it, "Let the record show." The phrase was a ritual, a spell that turned speech into law. He dipped the quill once more, the silver well nearly empty now. He would need to call for more ink soon, but he dreaded the interruption, the break in the rhythm that might allow him to think too clearly about what he was doing. He kept writing, the scratch of the nib filling the silence, a steady, rhythmic sound that matched the ticking of the clock outside. "Bring forward the weapon," the steward ordered. A bailiff stepped forward from the shadows near the wall, carrying a small box wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it on the table before the clerk, who unwrapped it with gloved hands. The pistol lay inside, dark and cold, the metal dull in the weak light. There was a scratch on the barrel, a thin white line that caught the eye. Thorne leaned forward, drawn to the mark despite himself. It looked like a mistake, a flaw in the manufacture that should have been polished away before the weapon was sold. "Identify the exhibit," the clerk said. "The pistol used on the 16th of April, the bailiff said. Thorne looked at Ferrers, who was looking at the pistol, his eyes fixed unblinking and unmoving on the scratch along the barrel. He did not look away, he did not flinch. He simply stared at the object that would seal his fate, his face devoid of expression. As Thorne dipped the quill, dark and viscous ink welled up. He touched the nib to the paper, and the ink flowed. The Peer's final reckoning is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. The trial of Laurence Earl Ferrers for the murder of John Johnson before the Right Honourable the House of Peers. In Westminster Hall, in full Parliament, on Wednesday the 16th, Thursday the 17th, and Friday the 18th of April, 1760, on the last of which days judgment for murder was given against him. Internet Archive. The trial of Laurence Earl Ferrers for the murder of John Johnson before the Right Honourable the House of Peers. In Westminster Hall, in full Parliament, on Wednesday the 16th, Thursday the 17th, and Friday the 18th of April, 1760, on the last of which days judgment for murder was given against him. Electronic resource, Internet Archive. Laurence Shirley, 4th Earl Ferrers. Earl Ferrers. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.